You know Richard Feynman, right? He's the super amazing physicist, famous for picking locks, staring at an atomic blast, being the only physicist to ever think outside the box, flirting with his students. He was super good with the ladies, playing the bongo drums, and not brushing his teeth. I just think it's kind of weird that, like, the most famous physicist is known for his personality rather than his physics. Like, internet people, do you know the physics that Richard Feynman did? It was like a lot of things. Do you know? Isn't it weird? Here's an example from this book I read earlier this year called Love Theoretically. And in it, she's like listing famous physicists, and she's like Einstein, Newton, Feynman. And like Einstein, we get it, relativity. Newton, gravity, the apple, we get it. Feynman. What did Feynman do exactly? This is honestly probably a bad example to do, like, for my audience, people who like and watch physics videos. You guys probably can come up with words to say. You can say, like, Feynman diagrams, probably. But, like, do you know what he did? And do you know it on the same level that you know what Newton did? I don't think so. That's because this is a weird list. Don't get me wrong. Feynman, amazing Nobel Prize winning physicist. He contributed a lot. But this list... this is like if someone was listing the greatest movies of all time and they were like, Casablanca, The Godfather, Ghostbusters. Or imagine someone listing the greatest basketball players of all time. Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Bernard King. Don't get me wrong, Bernard King, great basketball player, of course. Ghostbusters, great movie, super funny. But like greatest of all time? No, the list should be Newton, Maxwell, Einstein. The answer is Maxwell if you're making this list, right? James Clerk Maxwell, his complete theory of electrodynamics, the best, most important thing to come out of the 1800s in physics. It's Newton, Maxwell, Einstein. Okay, like Feynman is great, but he's not up there. But in popular culture, he is, because he's famous for being a famous physicist instead of being famous for his physics, which also, don't get me wrong, he did a lot of really good physics. I just think it's kind of weird. If you've never heard of Richard Feynman, he's a world famous physicist. He was born in 1918, he died in 1988. He was a famous professor, and he ended up at Caltech. He worked on the Manhattan Project. He worked in atomic physics and particle physics, and he got the Nobel Prize for his contributions to quantum electrodynamics. You have probably heard or seen a Feynman diagram. They're all around when people talk about physics. They're named after him, Richard Feynman. So he is well known in the physics community for his approach to doing physics, and he was very famous to physicists. But he became famous to the public, to like normal people who aren't professional physicists, in 1986 after the Challenger disaster. He was on the committee to investigate what went wrong. In this video, I'm going to talk about the legend of Richard Feynman and how I think it's interesting that it's not about physics in any way at all. But if you are interested in the physics of Richard Feynman, I've talked a lot about him on my channel. You can watch my QCD video where I talk about his contributions to QED. I have a video about antiparticles where I talk about him a lot. But like I said, I want to investigate the legend of Richard Feynman, the one you see on the internet, which has nothing to do with physics. I mean, what is this? What's going on here? What is this? How does this happen? How does someone become famous for being a famous physicist and not really for the physics they did while they were being a famous physicist? Where does the legend of Richard Feynman come from? And it's probably this book. This book is published in 1985, and it is called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. And it is a memoir full of stories of Richard Feynman's crazy antics. Oh, the subtitle is Adventures of a Curious Character by Richard P. Feynman. The P stands for Phillips. If you're curious, I'm hopefully putting a picture of this book right here. Great. A book full of stories about Richard Feynman is where the legend of Richard Feynman comes from. cool. I have two problems with this book. So first, when you're a child and you're interested in physics, the people in your life who care about you really want to encourage that, because like physicist is seen as like a good career option, I guess. And I remember in 6th grade when I was 12, my math teacher was like, oh, if you want to be a physicist, go get this book. This book will have all you need to know about being a physicist. So I immediately run to the library and I get this book and I go home and read it, and I'm just super disappointed because there's no physics in this book. It's just a bunch of stories of Richard Feynman doing a thing and being the smartest person to do that thing, and that's it. That's the whole book. There's no physics. I mean, maybe if you work in physics, like the backdrop is physics, but it's not like he's telling you how to be a physicist, which is what it was advertised like. So I was just immediately disappointed. Also, I very specifically remember this one section where Richard Feynman is an undergrad and he's assigned Faust, and he just doesn't want to read it because he thinks books are stupid and reading books are stupid. And I just hate that. I hated that when I was 12. I hate that now. The thing is, you know, you can like books and also science, and science is a creative field. I feel like I talk about this all the time, but it just really like put me in a bad mood. I didn't like the book. I put it away. I didn't think about it again until I went to undergrad. So my second problem with this book is that it encourages a specific type of behavior in undergraduate physics majors. I always called them Feynman bros, but on the internet, people call them Feynman fanboys. I kind of like Feynman bros better. So I have never met a female Feynman bro, but I'm sure that they could exist. The only requirement to be a Feynman bro is that you really take the Feynman lifestyle to heart. The Feynman lifestyle as presented in this book, which has two components. The first is that you are always the smartest guy in the room. So a Feynman bro gets handed this book when they're 13 years old and they're like, I want to be like Richard Feynman. I always want to have a zingy one-liner in a situation. I always want to be the one that gets the last word in. I always want to be the one that's the smartest guy in the room. But what's amazingly missing from this book is evidence that to become the smartest guy in the room, Richard Feynman, studied all the time, read papers all the time, like actually spent time learning physics. He didn't just go around convincing everyone how smart he was. But because that's not in the book, the Feynman bros don't realize that an essential component of doing physics is actually learning physics. So they just go around talking a big game about how they're going to be just like Richard Feynman. The second component of the Feynman lifestyle that the Feynman bro has to follow, as told in this book, is that women are inherently inferior to you. And if you want to be the smartest big boy physicist in the room, you need to make sure they know that. I think people are sometimes shocked to hear this, that exists in this book, especially because, as I said, if you are a precocious teenager interested in physics, people shove this book at you. They just put it into your hands like, oh, you want to be a physicist? Here's the coolest physicist ever. I feel like it's at this point in the video when Mr. Cultural Relativism is going to show up in the comments and be like, how dare you judge people from the past on their actions? That's not fair. Things were different back then. Women liked when men lied to them and pretended to be an undergrad, so that it was fine back then. It was fine. And I just know, actually, this book was published 40 years ago, which is just not that long ago. Richard Feynman should have known that women were people 40 years ago. Absolutely not. It's not how things were back then. What's wrong with you people? No, it's inappropriate then. It's inappropriate now. Oh yeah, the Feynman bros. So let me give you some examples of the Feynman bros in my undergrad career. So imagine you're in a Physics 1 lecture, baby's first physics course, Physics 1. The professor is like, hey guys, today we're going to talk about problems with constant acceleration, for the first time, because this is our first ever physics class. What if I was holding a bowling ball and I dropped it 2 meters to the ground? How long do you think it would take to hit the ground? And the Feynman bro in this class will just immediately raise his hand and be like, I don't think we're considering air resistance. Should we consider air resistance in this problem? And it's just like, dude, she said constant acceleration. Dude, this is our first ever physics class. Are we going to do hydro? Do you expect us to be doing hydro? Are you implying That you're the only person in this room that is aware that air exists? No, of course you don't need air resistance for that problem. We're not dropping a piece of paper. Why are you wasting everyone's time with this? You're not smarter because you know air exists. Why? You know, but like imagine that every single day. Every single day. Always talking about how cool Richard Feynman and how they're going to be cool just like Richard Feynman and just stealing everyone's lecture time forever. Let me give you another example. I was in Calc 2 and the professor was handing the exams back. She hands me mine, obviously turned upside down because like, what is that called? HIPAA, but for school. I've been out of academia too long. Anyway, she hands me my paper. She's like, good job, Angela. And then she's handing out the rest of the papers. And the guy, like, across from me, he looks at his paper and he looks at me and he's like, what did you get? And I hand him my paper and he looks back at me and he's like, whose dick did you have to suck to get a 99 on this test? Because he got like a 40 or something. And that's emblematic of the Feynman bro. He didn't study, but he's smart. He's a man. He's going to be a famous physicist, just like Richard Feynman. He should have gotten an A on this exam, and because he didn't, there must be something wrong on the exam. I must have done something crazy and immoral and wrong to get my A, because it's an impossible exam, because he didn't get an A, even though, you know, he didn't study or work the homework problems. I know this is going to sound like I'm complaining way too much for like what the behavior was, but you have to imagine 4 years of guys constantly talking about being super into Richard Feynman and also, you know, following you home after a lab or switching classes so you have the same schedule, even though I've already switched the classes to get out of those classes. Do you know what I mean? Just 4 full years of someone stealing the entire recitation. We didn't have recitation. What are those called? Like study sessions before an exam. Someone just stealing all of that time. Like a lot of Feynman bros will just fail their first exam and realize, oh my God, if I'm not smart, what am I? Oh my God, I'm afraid to try. I'm afraid to study because what if I try really hard and I still fail? Oh my gosh, what do I do? And then they go to therapy and they just learn how to study and they learn how to be a normal human being and it's totally fine. The other Feynman bros just fail out because they don't think doing physics is a component of being good at physics, of being the Richard Feynman. They don't understand the essential activity of, you know, learning the material. So like I said, this is a super small percentage, but like that one bad apple just ruins the environment for all of the women in the undergrad program. Just like, oh, I hate the class I'm about to go to. This guy just spends 30 minutes asking inane questions that don't make sense, and he never seems to understand that the professor is trying to shut him down. He doesn't understand that the topics he's discussing are irrelevant and he's wasting everyone's time. And it's like, why even go to this lecture? I actually really need to learn thermodynamics, but I can't because I'm stuck with this guy. Or it's like, oh, I can't go to that study session because that weird guy is going to be there and it doesn't matter where I sit, he will get up out of his seat and move next to me and then pretend to drop his pencil and try to touch me. I'm just never going to get to go to the study group. And it goes away eventually because, like I said, they all drop out. The last Feynman bro I ran into during my university education was in grad school. It was a guy who failed a year full of classes talking about how he doesn't care. He's going to be Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman never went to class. All that matters is the physics that you do. Richard Feynman worked alone forever. He never worked with anybody. No one ever believed his work. I'm going to be just like Richard Feynman. And then he got kicked out. But not before following one of the women in my cohort home and banging on the door for a full hour while she did not open it, and then she had to spend the rest of the year getting escorted home, and he got kicked out for grades because apparently that part is fine. You can just do that. So it goes away eventually though. But then I forgot about it because yes, it's annoying and a little scary, and whenever you talk about it, people act like it's not a big deal at all. Like, oh, you can't go to the study sessions? Like, that's your choice. Or like, maybe they're just neurodivergent, when like being neurodivergent does not excuse this behavior. You can't harass women or steal everyone's lecture time and then blame it on neurodivergence. Like, that's not an excuse. It's just this insidious, casual, everyday kind of sexism that just ruins your whole undergrad experience, because you want to go to the study session because you want to learn physics, you want to talk about physics, that's what you want to do, but the creepy guy's there. And when you tell the guy who runs the study session, like, oh, this guy's kind of creepy to me, he's just gonna err on the side of like not making a fuss about it because the guy was never creepy towards him, and so you just don't get to go to the study session. Like, you just don't get to do a lot of this stuff. In my physics life, it's just like a 100% accurate red flag. A correlation you can always trust, p-value of 1. If a guy is talking a lot about Richard Feynman, he's gonna be like casually sexist towards you. He's gonna try to be the smartest guy in the room. He's gonna talk over you, and then he's gonna fail out of the program. But that has nothing to do with Richard Feynman. And it wasn't until I started making videos on the internet about science that the Feynman bros kind of reappeared in my comment section, and I started to realize, like now as an adult, the Feynman legend has nothing to do with physics. So why is it the Feynman legend? I don't want you to think physicists are immune to this behavior. Like, of course, not everyone who's misogynist and also super obsessed with Richard Feynman and his lifestyle for some reason fails out, right? Surely some of them go on to be physicists. So if you've been watching my channel for a while, you may remember me reading QEG by Richard Feynman earlier this year and talking about it in a video. And I loved the text of this book. And I was like, ooh, Richard Feynman. Did he do a thing? Do I love this? But what I didn't like was the introduction by one Professor Anthony Z. And I have to read it to you. Richard Feynman was not only an extraordinary physicist, but also an extraordinary figure, a swashbuckling personality the likes of which theoretical physics has not seen before or hence. Occasionally, theoretical physicists will while away on an idle moment comparing the contributions of Feynman and Schwinger. They got the Nobel Prize at the same time. Both nice Jewish boys from New York and almost exact contemporaries. The senseless discussion serves no purpose, but it is a fact that while Julian Schwinger was a shy and retiring person, Dick Feynman was an extreme extrovert, this stuff of legends, with his bongo drums, showgirls, and other trappings of a carefully cultivated image, enthusiastically nurtured by a legion of idolaters. He is surely the best-loved theoretical physicist next to Einstein. The brilliant Russian physicist Lev Landau famously had a logarithmic scale for ranking theoretical physicists, with Einstein on top. It's also well known that Landau moved himself up half a step after he formulated the theory of phase transitions. I have my own scale, one of fun, on which I place theoretical physicists. I know either in person or in spirit. Yes, it's true, most theoretical physicists are dull as dishwater and rank near minus infinity on the logarithmic scale. Go fuck yourself, bro. Dull as dishwater? Do you know your colleagues are gonna read this? Like, fuck you. Maybe all your friends are boring because you're boring. Whatever. Play Schrodinger. On top. Schrodinger? Dude, this was written in 2006. The diary is full of the proud pedophilia we're out. Is Schrodinger, known pedophile, cooler than Feynman? Known, I don't know, philanderer? In your book, is it the sexual exploits with minors that make you think Schrodinger's cooler? What's going on there? It's aged poorly, I guess. Where are we? But Feynman would surely rank close behind. I can't tell you where I land on my own scale. I can tell you, babe, because anyone who's gonna make a list of which of their friends are coolest is gonna be... I don't need to make fun of you. You've done it yourself. I'm gonna stop. Okay. But what fun Feynman was. Early in my career, Feynman asked me to go to the nightclub with him. One of Feynman's colleagues told me that the invitation showed that he took me seriously as a physicist. But while I was eager to tell Feynman my thoughts about Yang-Mills theory, this reads like love theoretically, and I can't stop. He only wanted my opinion on the legs of the dancing girls on stage. Of course, in the psychology of hero worship, nobody gives two hoots about some bozo of a physicist who plays drums and likes showgirls. So all right. My scale is really fun times talent. Landau's scale with fun factored in, with the stock of Einstein falling and that of Landau rising. So I hated that. I really like the text of this book. I like the Feynman part, but the introduction, It's cringe. It's cringe. It's embarrassing. You think everyone's dull as dishwater, but Feynman's super cool because he took you to a strip club. You can just go. If you have money, they'll like you just as much as they like Feynman. You know people can read this. This is published. Your friends and colleagues can read this. It's embarrassing. This is what I mean when I say Feynman bro. Like, what is that? You're impressed not with his physics. You're impressed because he went to a strip club. You can just do that. What is this? But this introduction also has nothing to do with Richard Feynman, physicist, right? So this train of thought sent me on a journey. I don't hate Richard Feynman. I hate people who worship Richard Feynman. I hate people who think being an asshole makes you smart. I hate people who think casual misogyny is like good or cool. And none of that is Richard Feynman, the man. Do I even know anything about Richard Feynman, the man? So I read the book and the sequel. You didn't think I was just talking about like a 20-year-old memory of this book, right? I reread this book for this video. It would be kind of disingenuous for me to pretend that I remembered the text of this book any more than like vague, negative, bad thoughts from 20 years ago. I reread these. Actually, last November, I decided to read everything Richard Feynman has ever written. Lectures, essays, textbooks, memoir. I read biographies. I read books of letters. I read books of quotes. I listened to interviews. I watched documentary. Anything I could get my hands on. Vaguely related to Richard Feynman. I consumed it. Is that what you would say? I spent 1 year with Richard Feynman. Honestly, that could be my book. My Year of Feynman, subtitle, Anatomy of a Legend. My business email is in the box. Send me an email, publishers. And I think if you watch my channel, you can tell I feel like I've mentioned Richard Feynman in nearly every video because he's been in my brain. Because I've just constantly been reading these in the background for a full year. I can't stop. What would Richard Feynman do? What would he think about this? It's a little worrisome. Richard Feynman, very prolific, it seems. Who knew? Okay, so obviously I started with these two books, right? This is the famous Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. You have to start here. You have to. And the thing about this book is that it hits different as an adult. As a kid, I remember this guy doesn't really talk about physics and also he hates books. Gross. As an adult, the big takeaway is that Richard Feynman is an asshole. In these stories, he spends a lot of time looking down on people who aren't as good as him, the famous physicist, but he thinks that as long as he dedicates a paragraph to being like, now I don't think I would know color theory better than a painter. Of course, he's a professional. And then he proves how smart he is to that person. And actually, he is better than them. And then he just like DreamWorks faces like, I'm Richard Feynman. It's off-putting. It's off-putting. There's this story with a waitress where he has the waitress and he's like, I'm better at physics than you, and he puts like a coin. It's the 40s, so a coin is a good tip. Like imagine a nickel because the meal cost $1 or whatever. He puts a nickel under a glass of water that's full of water. And he's like, if she knows physics, she'll be able to like stick a plate under it and turn it over and get the nickel out. And she doesn't. She needs the nickel. She spills the water all over herself. As a child, I'm sure I thought like, oh, he thinks more people should know physics. Okay. But as an adult, I'm just like, what an asshole. She's serving you. That is her tip. You don't get to pour water on her, actually. Also, something I didn't pick up on, thankfully, I think as a 12-year-old child, is the pickup artist stories. In this book, Richard Feynman meets a guy that he literally calls the master, and the master teaches him, it's really cringy, the master teaches him that, you know, if you nag women a little bit, if you're a little bit mean to them, they'll like you even more and they'll be nice to you. In this book, he calls a woman a whore because she wants to go on a date with him and he's going to buy her a sandwich, but she's not going to have sex with him, so she's a whore. And in this book, he lies to undergrads and tells them he's an undergrad so he can trick them into sleeping with him. And he's like, huh, isn't that so kooky and crazy? What a curious character. And what I'm confused about, I guess, is these are the stories that he chose of all his life stories to publish as a memoir. These are the stories he thinks are funny. These are the stories he's proud of. And people read this and go, oh my God, that guy's my idol. I'm a Feynman bro now. I love Richard Feynman. I hope I can be just like him and pour water on a waitress. What? I think part of the problem is that there's a specific type of person who hears these stories and just takes them at face value. Richard Feynman says he's super good with the ladies and the ladies all loved him. He must have been super good with the ladies and the ladies all loved him. It was an Indiana Jones situation. Cool. I hope I can be like him.
Who's famous in a number of dimensions. To scientists, he's a giant of 20th century physics, winner of the Nobel Prize for his foundational insights in quantum electrodynamics, among many other things. To the public, he's a refreshing contradiction to the stereotypes about physicists, a safe-cracking, bongo-playing, mildly philanderous nonconformist whose heavily Brooklyn-accented voice you've probably heard either relaying some bit of no-nonsense pragmatic wisdom about the only sensible way to view the world, or else some wry joke told through a crooked smile.
Quantum electrodynamics while playing the bongos at a strip club. Richard Feynman was still around because he was awesome and I want to meet him and be his best friend. But after a long battle with 2 different types of cancer, he died in 1988. His last words were, "I'd hate to die twice." It is so boring. Hail Richard Feynman, king of physics, and my heart.
And I want to say, I don't think Hank, Henry, or Grant, 3 men I don't know, have never met, and probably shouldn't be calling them by their first names. I don't think they're sexist. I just think some people here, like Richard Feynman, super smart, but also super charismatic, and he could get laid all the time if he wanted, and people just go, nice. But it's just, if you're a woman, I don't think you just take that story at face value. It's more like this article, which I love, which I never stop recommending, by Leila McNeill, Surely You're a Creep, Mr. Feynman. Or it's me hearing Feynman was super good with the ladies. I just think of all the creeps who are emulating his behavior and making women uncomfortable. I assume the women weren't receptive because, honestly, because I think of a very specific moment of my life, because I feel like I've lived this waitress experience, I will tell it to you now. So in 2008, when I was 18, I worked at Cracker Barrel. And I was the hostess, and part of the hostess job when it's super busy is to just like walk around and look for anyone with a face like this. And you walk up and they're like, I'm waiting on butter. And you're like, of course. And you grab the butter, or you grab the jelly, or you grab the check. And also, like, I walk around with a coffee. And I'm like, hey, can I top up your coffee? Because those little things really ruin the customer experience, and you really want to make sure everyone's having a good time. Anyway, I'm walking around with the coffee. And this woman gestures me to her table. It's a 4-top, 2 like preteens and a mom and a dad in like their mid-40s, I guess. And I fill up her coffee, and the dad gestures. I fill up his coffee, and I'm like, there you go, guys. Can I get you anything else? And this man, this adult man in his 40s looks at me, I guess also adult, 18, looks me up and down, and he says to me, honey, why don't you stick your finger in it and make it a little sweeter for me? And I said, ew, what? No. There's sugar on the table. And when I tell you, this man flew into a rage. Like, he immediately stood up. His face was red. He was like silent whisper screaming at me like, how dare you? I'm a customer. I'm gonna get you. And like, you might not know this, but at Cracker Barrel, and probably most restaurants, people have headsets. So like, someone alerted the manager, and he was out there quick, and he just shoved me away. But that man wanted me to be fired because I was not receptive to him suggesting that he could suck on my finger so his coffee would taste sweeter, actually. And when I hear Richard Feynman was like, haha, I gave her a nickel under a cup and she had to get the water, I think about how that woman, unlike me in 2008, who, you know, could just get any other job, me in 2008, who, you know, could open a bank account, could start a business, could go to college, me, I don't have to take that. Actually, Cracker Barrel paid really well for 2008. It was like $11 or $13 or something. I don't need that $13 an hour, actually. I don't have to listen to a 45-year-old man tell me he wants to suck my fingers, actually. And the woman in Feynman's story did in fact have to do that because, you know, the ERA didn't exist. HR didn't exist. She couldn't get a bank account. She couldn't start a business. She may have needed that nickel. And she had no recourse. And at the end of the story, he comes back in, and the only thing she can do is give him to another waitress. So she refuses to serve him, and Richard Feynman is like, I guess she should have learned physics. And it's an awful story. It's upsetting to read, and I can't believe it was published. Okay, I really think some people here, Richard Feynman flirted with his students, and they just assume, nice, they must have been receptive. Indiana Jones situation. There's actually this play I read by Peter Parnell with a foreword by Alan Alda, because Alan Alda is the producer, and Alan Alda played Feynman, and I love Alan Alda. I bet it was a great performance. I really like Alan Alda, but the context of this play is that Richard Feynman is dying. Did I tell you Richard Feynman is dying for like 10 years? He has this horrible cancer battle with like a couple different abdominal surgeries. And like eventually the doctor calls and he's like, there's nothing else we can do. And that's the day this play takes place. And in this play, he's like grappling with physics and life in monologues. I think there's only 2 actors in this play. So the other actor is a woman playing an undergrad student. And in the play, she comes into Feynman's office on the day he learns like he's dying and it will be soon. And she's like, Professor Feynman, I have some questions about the quantum. Cringe. No. What? Alan Alda, do you think this is like an accurate portrayal of Richard Feynman? And if you do you think he's a good professor for allowing his student to do that, for being receptive to his student flirting with him? That's inappropriate, and you should have shut it down, and it's weird. It's weird that specifically you chose that specific Legend of Richard Feynman component to make such a big part of this. It's cringe. Guys, it's all cringe. What's the cringe count at? I'm sorry. What I think about when I read stuff like this is that Feynman taught at Caltech, a place where women were not allowed to day in the halls of the physics department until the year 1970. So, imagine an 18-year-old woman, 40 years younger than Richard Feynman, the first ever female undergraduate student, so excited, walks in to her first ever physics class, and oh my god, it's going to be taught by one of the most famous physicists alive, Richard Feynman. This is the best day of her life. She's so excited. Women in STEM, yay. And she walks in, and Richard Feynman is the professor. Is just like, hey boys, they're letting women in. At least we got something nice to look at. You want to let me draw you nude later, honey? Do you think she likes that? I don't. Do you think she throws a fit about it? Do you think that woman, the first ever woman allowed to be in that building, thinks that she has the option of, I don't know, going to the department head and being like, hi, I know I'm the first ever woman allowed in this building, but the most famous man here who brings in the most money just like made it weird for me, and it was really uncomfortable, and I would like you to do something about it. I'm going to throw a huge fit, and I'm going to make sure you all regret finally letting women in. Do you think she did that? Or did you think she sat down, opened her notebook, and went? Do you think this face is like someone being receptive to your advances? Because that's not. That's a woman who feels like she doesn't have another option. That's what that is. And that's what I think she did. And I think Feynman went home and was like, nailed it. She was super into me. Where I'm at is at the disparity between the asshole content in the 2 memoir books. Like, you read those and you're like, oh, this guy sucks. And so Why is there this legend of Richard Feynman? Maybe these aren't as popular as I think they are, but then where is the hero worship coming from if not from these books? So, there are two comments that I got a long time on my channel that just live in my head rent-free. The first, Richard Feynman is the only physicist to think outside the box. I just quote this all the time. The second is simply, thank God for Richard Feynman. And just, sirs, what do you mean? What do those two things mean? Where did it come from? And what does it mean? Thank God for Richard Feynman. What? For what specifically? Like, please just tell the whole class if you have something to share. Thank God for Richard Feynman. But these Feynman worshippers will show up anytime you mention Richard Feynman. Probably not on this video, because the second I started talking about, like, women are in physics and they get mistreated, they left. They all left because they're not into listening to that. So we don't have to worry about for this video. Back on Twitter, there was a grown adult man cosplaying as Richard Feynman. So luckily, you know, because Twitter doesn't exist anymore, there's a guy called Terrence Eden who documented some of these embarrassing tweets on his blog. He titled this post, "Who do you think you're kidding, Mr. Feynman?" which is the second time I've referenced an article that has a title playing on the "Surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman," which is why I didn't do it for this video. But look at these. Look at this. What is this? What are you doing? What is this? Richard Feynman died in 1988. What are you doing? Like, some of these are quotes from Richard Feynman, but most of them are just, they're just made up. They're just self-help garbage. Like, what is this? Is this what you think he would say? Are you pretending to be Richard Feynman? So this guy, the guy who ran the Professor Feynman account, he posted a Medium article, and it was titled, "Why I Curate." He used the word curate for the Professor Feynman account. And it's cringe. I'm sorry. I feel embarrassed even telling it to you. This man spent years pretending to be Richard Feynman on Twitter. This man posted multiple tweets per day, spent years of his only life on Earth cosplaying as a dead physicist. So there's this trait of people to show up and randomly comment, "Thank God for Richard Feynman." If anyone, Feynman. I say it wrong. Feynman. I'll get it. It's fine. Feynman. There is this trait of people to show up. The Feynman bros. They'll show up and they'll be like, "Thank God for Richard Feynman. I love Richard Feynman. What a hero." For example, there's this pretty famous video where he's talking about thinking from different points of view. So Feynman's being interviewed and he's trying to convince the audience that you have to think about things differently. And he uses a pretty bad example of brushing your teeth and like whether or not it's actually good. Roll the clip.
Every morning we brush our teeth. What is the evidence that the brushing of teeth does us any good in cavities? So you start wondering, are we all, imagine if as the earth turns on the orbit, there's an edge between light and dark. And along that edge, all the people along that edge were doing the same ritual for no good reason. Just like in the Middle Ages and other rituals. And you try to picture this perpetual line of toothbrushes going around the earth. It's to take the world from another point of view. Now, it may well be that brushing teeth is a very good thing because it gets rid of cavities, and you can find out whether it does or it doesn't by trying to find out. Now, you can ask your dentist. He says, of course. And you say, how about evidence? I have not found the evidence from dentists because they just learned it in school. Now, I'm not trying to argue that it's good or bad to brush teeth. What I'm trying to argue for is to think about things from a new point of view.
Just notice this is from a channel called Wise Owl Wealth. There are tons of channels like this where they just post random quotes from people they consider very, very smart. Like, it's supposed to be inspirational or something. Like, it'll just be a 20-second video of sappy music, and Richard Feynman is like, if you want to solve a physics problem, you have to think. And it's like, what does that mean? It's meaningless. What do you think that it's just meaningless bullshit? But anyway, people watch the interview where Richard Feynman is trying to say, think differently. You need to look at the world from multiple different views to get the real solution to a problem. And people watch that and they're like, cool, so we're not supposed to brush our teeth. Richard Feynman didn't brush his teeth, right? And it's just insane behavior. Of course he brushes his teeth. What do you mean? How do you watch that and get the idea that he doesn't brush it. I just have one more. There's this video of Murray Gell-Mann. Murray Gell-Mann is a famous physicist. I've talked about him on my channel before. And he worked at Caltech also. And in the video, he's talking about Richard Feynman and how he didn't really appreciate working with Richard Feynman because Richard Feynman wasn't a very good collaborator.
After that, we didn't collaborate very much anymore. I liked the situation where one thought in terms of we do this, we do that, and I am under those conditions. I'm willing to be very generous about credit and so on, pooling ideas and joint responsibility. Whereas Dick kept thinking in terms of what I did. I did this. I thought of that. I thought of this. I thought of that, and so on. And actually, he thought very highly of me and of my contributions. That wasn't the problem. It was just the way in which he operated was very much, what shall I say, it was one of being very self-contained, even though we were collaborating.
And this video is posted all over a bunch of different YouTube channels, and most of the comments will be like, we get it. Richard Feynman's an asshole. And I assume they read the book, right? Because he is an asshole. But some of the comments are like, thank God for Richard Feynman. Who's this Murray guy? He just must be jealous. He just must be jealous of the brilliant genius, super genius of Richard Feynman. And I just find this very funny. I find it funny that people would think Murray Gell-Mann was jealous of Richard Feynman just because there's never existed two more comparable people. Like, they're both from working class Jewish families from the Northeast. They both show this incredible aptitude for math and science as very young children. They both go to Ivy League schools, Yale, Princeton, MIT, but like in different orders for undergrad and grad for them. Feynman's really well known for QED. Gell-Mann's really well known for QCD. Feynman worked on the parton. Gell-Mann worked on the quark. They both won the Nobel Prize. They both worked at Caltech. But also they're both famous in physics as like characters. Like Feynman's got all his crazy, goofy, curious character stories. Murray Gell-Mann is also famous for being a very specific type of person. Like, he's always correcting how people are pronouncing words. I talked about Murray Gell-Mann on my channel in my Gell-Mann amnesia video about Michio Kaku. You know of Richard Feynman, famous physicist, but do you know Murray Gell-Mann was the inspiration for Dr. Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park? Dr. Ian Malcolm jealous? I don't think so. I don't think so, actually.
Your mind, he's absolutely out of his mind.
I'm going to tell you a secondhand story, so take it with a grain of salt. Some of my graduate school professors were in grad school at Caltech when Gell-Mann and Feynman were both there. And I heard a version of this story from two different people. I think it's true, but obviously this is secondhand. You follow your heart. So they talked about how at the colloquiums, a colloquium is when a young, usually startup researcher comes in and talks about their research in hopes to collaborate or just like get like the word out there on what they're doing. And in the colloquiums, Gell-Mann would arrive on time with a little notebook. He would open the notebook and slowly throughout the lecture, if he thought what the person was saying wasn't interesting or good enough for his fancy brain, he would like shut the notebook very obviously because he wasn't taking notes. And Feynman would show up late. He would sit next to Gell-Mann and he would say, "Hey Murray, is this one any good?" aloud. In the room, the auditorium where a person is speaking, and Murray would respond with an answer. And then they would then discuss, while this person is talking, what part of their idea had merit or not. And this is incredibly rude. They're both assholes. And maybe they were friends because, like, sometimes assholes are friends with each other. And I also believe that Murray Gell-Mann didn't like the way Feynman worked, so even though he respected his work, he didn't want to work with him, and that's fine. But this just brings me back to these Feynman bros not knowing anything about physics. Like, they don't know anything about Feynman's physics. They just know he's a famous physicist. So when they hear Gell-Mann They don't know who that is. And honestly, Gell-Mann's work is probably more important to the field than Feynman's. This just points that the Feynman bros don't know any physics because they don't know who Gell-Mann is, because they think that he would be jealous of Richard Feynman. Absolutely he would not be. Murray Gell-Mann did the one thing Richard Feynman was never able to do. Is this how I want to drop this piece of information? Is this a good time? Should I bust out of the wallpaper? I'm not a writer. Have I built up enough suspense for me to tell you that Richard Feynman never wrote a book? But Angela, you're sitting in front of a giant stack of books that say that they're by Richard Feynman. I know. I'm as shocked as you are. Richard Feynman never wrote a book. So last November 2023, I had the brilliant idea of reading everything Feynman had ever written. I did not like Richard Feynman, but I realized that's because of unrelated experiences to Richard Feynman. The legend of Richard Feynman has nothing to do with physics. I should investigate. Do I really not like Richard Feynman? I'm going to read all these books. So I go on Thrift Books and I just start ordering everything vaguely related to Richard Feynman, and it's a huge chunk of books. They start coming in the mail. One Feynman book every couple of days. But obviously I'm going to start with Surely You're Joking, so I wait for this one to come in the mail, and then I read it and the sequel, and I'm like, oh my god, this guy is an asshole. I keep getting these books in the mail, right? So I'm just like, oh no, I wasted all this money on this huge library of books in which the author is an asshole, and I'm just not going to want to read them. But I soldier on, right? And I read Surely You're Joking, now time to read the sequel. What do you, underline, care what other people think? And this is the next logical place to be, right? So I open up this book and I read the preface, and I'm going to read you a short section as well. Second, the stories in this book fit together more loosely than those in Surely You're Joking, where they were arranged chronologically to give a semblance of order. That resulted in some readers getting the mistaken idea that Surely You're Joking is an autobiography. And this preface is written by one Mr. Ralph Leighton, the author of these two books. Now, Ralphie, do you think people got the mistaken idea that this was a memoir because there's one author on this page and it says Richard Feynman, and the side says by Richard Feynman, and the back has the author details for one man, Richard Feynman, and if you look in that top left corner there, it's autobiography. So the booksellers know to place this in the autobiography section. Should we look up the definition of autobiography? This book is written quite poorly. I think it's unedited, and it is written in the style of a conversation, like someone is talking to you, which would make you think it's an autobiography. But I mean, this is an interesting development, right? I'm interested in finding the source of the legend of Richard Feynman, and I think it's these two books, and I found out that, hey, actually, these two books that say by Richard Feynman are not written by Richard Feynman. These two books are written by Ralph Leighton. So does the legend of Richard Feynman even have anything to do with Richard Feynman? What is this? What do you mean he didn't write these books that say he wrote these books? Look, this isn't my book channel, but just because the exclamation point exists does not mean we need to shove it at the end of every paragraph. An editor needs to take this book and remove 90% of the exclamation points, because that is not how people talk. Let me tell you the story of how this book was written. Richard Feynman would have a weekly drumming session with his friend Ralph Leighton. Richard Feynman was 50, Ralph Leighton was 20, and Richard Feynman would tell all these crazy stories, and Ralph Leighton was like, oh my gosh, you're the best. And then 15 years later, Ralph Leighton was like, we gotta write these stories down. We should make a book. And Richard Feynman was like, cool, put my name on it when you're done. And this is how you find out all the books that say by Richard Feynman are written, actually. He would give a speech and someone would be like, whoa, that should be a book. And they would record him, they would edit it, they would rephrase it, they would rearrange it, they would fact check it, and they would turn it into a book, and they would slap RPF on it, right? Or he gave a series of lectures like the Feynman lectures. And then he goes off for a sabbatical, and separate people listen to those recorded lectures, fact check them, rework the problems, write them down, create graphics, and then publish the book. And Richard Feynman's like, cool, we did it. You know, Richard Feynman turns out not very prolific, never wrote a book. I feel like somebody's going to disagree with me and be like, but he wrote the speech, he wrote the lectures. That's not the same thing as writing a book. These books are heavily edited. They're reworded. They're fact-checked. They have to check the grammar. They have to do graphics. They have to do citations. They have to find all the sources. They have to make sure it flows and it makes sense and that the reader has all the context they need, because there's no visual cues, because this is not someone talking to you. These are books, and books are different than giving lectures. Feynman wrote his lectures. The Feynman lectures, the books, were written by people who wrote books, actually. Giving a lecture is not writing a book, and Feynman never wrote a book. And I think this comes through when you read all these books, because some of these are really bad. Some of them are written as if the author has the character of Richard Feynman in his head, and he's like, this is how Richard Feynman talks, exclamation point. And some of them are just like, you can tell they listen to audio and they just kind of removed the ums and ahs, and the book doesn't really make sense. And some of these are very good, and you can tell that whoever wrote that one was like really knowledgeable on the subject, was really passionate about making sure citations were proper, was making sure it was fact check, because a lot of these, including the Feynman lectures, have bad math in them, which is normal for math textbooks and physics textbooks, right? But like, it wasn't Richard Feynman doing it. And so the other person like had a lot on their plate because they didn't originally write the lecture. They don't know what Feynman was trying to do with that example problem. It makes it harder to understand if it's correct or not. Do you get what I'm saying? This is a very complicated problem. Richard Feynman never wrote a book. So who's responsible for the legend of Richard Feynman? In the introduction to this book by Christopher Sykes, which is based on the documentary, Michelle Feynman is talking about how silly and goofy her father was. And she describes him walking around, reading Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and like laugh crying because he's so funny. And it's like maybe he was laughing because it's the first time he had ever heard those stories, because he didn't write the book. And I will talk more about this book, I think. This is Genius by James Gleick. I would call this the definitive biography of Richard Feynman. It was written shortly after his death, and James Gleick, is that how you say his name? He was given kind of a bunch of access to like Feynman's office, his files, his documents at home, and this is fact-checked and sourced. This is it. And in this book, James Gleick says Richard Feynman never wrote a book, which is surprising for people to learn, because, you know, lots of books say they're written by Richard Feynman. So in November of 2023, I declared a reading goal. I'm going to read every single book Richard Feynman has ever written. And the thing is, I achieved that goal immediately because Richard Feynman never wrote a book. And you know, if you are falling behind on your reading goals this year, just say you're going to read the entire RPF oeuvre and you're done. You did it. Richard Feynman never wrote a book. Look at this. Look at what I've been living with for a year, and none of them were written by Richard Feynman. But see, the thing is, I started with these two books. And so I got to this book where I learned neither of these were written by Richard Feynman. These were written by Ralph Leighton. And I was kind of relieved because I was like, great, because these books are awful. So their poor quality, their insidious sexism with no editing or self-reflection is not indicative of what the rest of the books will be like, because these were not written by Richard Feynman, but surely these were, right? No, they weren't. But like, at least they're not all Ralph Leighton originals. Oh my God. And then I started thinking of the context in which these books were written. So Ralph Leighton, 20-year-old guy, hanging out every single week with Richard Feynman, 50-year-old man. And I'm not suggesting anything weird happened. Intergenerational friendships are great. These two guys were friends for like their life. I think Richard Feynman was like the best man at Ralph Leighton's wedding. I think I read that in one of these. So like, they were friends. They liked each other. They enjoyed each other's company. But Ralph Leighton is like enamored with Richard Feynman. He's impressed. He believes the legend of Richard Feynman. This guy's the smartest guy. He's always the coolest guy in the room. The ladies love him. And Richard Feynman has this rapt audience who he wants to impress. And when you realize Feynman is trying to impress this specific type of audience, you realize that these stories are totally fake. None of these stories are true. Well, the one exception is the Challenger disaster story, which is in this book. And that story obviously has to be true because there would be legal ramifications if it wasn't true. But then you read this whole book where Richard Feynman is the hero in every story. Every story ends with a witty little one-line zinger and an exclamation point. And then you get to this book, and the singular story where Richard Feynman is not the hero and the bestest boy is the one with the Challenger disaster. And it's kind of suspicious, and it's like, they're fake stories. They're not true. They're just not true. So obviously I absolutely must give you an example. I just can't say, oh, all these are lies and not give you an example. So rather than have me tell you one of the classic Feynman stories from this book, I'm going to have Michelle Feynman tell you the classic Feynman story.
When he was introduced to someone at a party who spoke a foreign language, he would pretend to be fluent in their native language. The amazing thing is that his resolute confidence and full commitment to the prank often fooled them into thinking that this gibberish was somehow an unfamiliar regional dialect. And they would say, what a shame it was. They didn't speak the same version of the language.
Let's put on our little AP English hats and look at the facts of this story. Richard Feynman meets a stranger who has an obvious foreign accent. Richard Feynman pretends to speak the language with which he thinks that accent is from. This goes on for a while. Eventually, the stranger says, I must not recognize that dialect. From Richard Feynman's perspective, and also Michelle Feynman's perspective, because she's telling the story, Richard Feynman begins speaking gibberish in the dialect of the language he expects that person has an accent in. And he convinces that stranger that they speak the same language, but the stranger just doesn't recognize the regional dialect. Okay, we can also think of it from the stranger's perspective. So imagine you're a professor from the University of Stockholm, and you get invited to give a talk at Caltech. How exciting. So you fly over, what is that, like 20 hours? And you land in the morning, and your host picks you up, and he's like, great, there's a faculty party tonight, rest up, and then all the big guys will be there, come on over. And he picks you up, he takes you to the party, and oh my gosh, Richard Feynman is there. You're so excited. The most famous physicist in the world. You love his work. You're excited to hopefully talk about your work. And you ask your host to introduce you. You walk over and you put your hand out and you're like, Professor Feynman, I really loved your quantum helium paper. And Feynman interrupts you and looks you in the face and starts Swedish chefing you. And it keeps going on. Like, this man is mocking your accent to your face. And everyone is looking at you because Richard Feynman is the most famous person in the room. He's this huge character. He's the life of the party. Everyone wants to hear what he's saying. And at this moment, he is mocking you to your face in a room where you're a stranger and you don't know anyone. And you feel this has been going on for a long time, so you have to respond. So what do? Oh, I guess I don't recognize that dialect. Which side of the story, if the factual facts of the story are true, do you think is more realistic? Listen, you and I, we both speak at least one language. Do you think that anyone could ever speak gibberish at you, but you would confuse that gibberish for the language you speak, but you couldn't recognize any of the words? Do you think that would ever happen? Also, in my example, I chose Stockholm, and I said Feynman was Swedish chefing. But imagine instead I chose China or Korea, which the Swedish chefing version would be a hate crime, which makes Richard Feynman an asshole, right? This is an asshole thing to do. There is no world in which a person could... Oh my god. It's cringy, it's so embarrassing, it's obviously a fake story. There is no world in which this story... Like, if this story is true, Richard Feynman was an asshole, and that stranger changed the subject immediately to end the embarrassment because they were embarrassed. Or, hear me out, that's a fake story, because of course it's a fake story. What? You were speaking gibberish so well that you convinced the person you knew that... No! That doesn't make any sense. It's so embarrassing that multiple people have repeated this story about Richard Feynman as if it's true. Then you read the book. And you realize he does that same story like 8 times. In this book, he gets yelled at by an Italian woman, and so he speaks in Latin, and she's so impressed because she thought it was Italian. In this book, oops, he studied Spanish, but he's going to Brazil. He goes to Japan, and he pretends to speak Japanese. He goes to Greece. It's all Greek to me. He tells that story about how his dad knew the Chinese names for birds. His dad didn't speak Chinese. Like, it's when you remember that these stories were told over 10 years of weekly drumming sessions that it just becomes obvious that none of these stories were true. You start to realize Feynman has these like old man anecdotes that he just repeats. Most of the time, it's him being able to super geniusly be able to speak a language that he doesn't actually speak. What a character. Or another one of the anecdotes is like someone with a profession he looks down on, but he says he doesn't look down on it in the text, so it's fine, like a painter or a waitress or a hotel clerk or a cab driver, and he'll like prove how good he is at physics, and then he'll DreamWorks face and be like, I guess I am pretty much better than that guy, I guess. But it's not just me. The fact that these stories read as fake comes up in all these biographies. So this is Richard Feynman, A Life in Science, John Gribben and Mary Gribben. And it's funny because they start, like, the prologue to this book, like, does the world really need another book about Richard Feynman? I don't think so. Let me read to you from the prologue, of course. Were those stories accurate? We asked Feynman's sister Joan on a visit to Pasadena in April 1995. It's easy to tell which stories are accurate, she replied. How? We asked. My brother didn't lie. Ralph Leighton, to whom the stories are told, agrees, but stresses that Feynman was a showman who loved telling stories. These stories were all true, and that they were about real things that had happened to Feynman, but he used to try telling them in different ways, with different emphasis, until he found which way worked best. So are they all true? If you tell them in different ways with different emphasis and rearrange them and then tell the same story a bunch of times in a row? No, let me refer to the other biography. So, this one, James Gleek, genius. This is the definitive one, like I said. I read this book third in, like, chronological order. And as soon as I learned that Ralph Leighton wrote those other books, I immediately looked up Ralph Leighton in this book. And in the acknowledgments, James Gleek is like, Ralph Leighton, who drew from Feynman the reminiscences, wow, that became Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and What Do You Care About What Other People Think, generously provided the original tapes of these interviews over nearly a decade. He generously provided. These are the stories that Feynman retold and refined over his lifetime. Mostly accurate, but strongly filtered. I've tried not to lean on them too heavily for the reasons that I hope emerge in the text. The reasons that emerge in the text are that James Gleek went to Feynman's office and found papers with the same stories written around with different details, like he was workshopping the stories, because they're not true stories. They're constantly exaggerated and retold and overstated so that Feynman's always the hero. And that's why they're not in most of the biographies, because they're not true stories, because these books don't have true stories in them. Or at least they're overly exaggerated, I guess. Like, you read these and you can really hear Feynman in the shower being like, man, it would be better if I said that. Do you know what I mean? Listen, I don't think he's lying. I wouldn't call this lying. This is like old man anecdotes. Like the way your grandpa tells the same story about a dog or whatever. That's what Feynman was doing. Did Feynman know that they would be taped and written down and published in books where when you read them back to back to back, they sound like obvious made up cringy ass stories? It's just weird. to read a bunch of stories in a row where the main character is like, and then I was the funniest, smartest guy and the most misogynistic guy in the room. And then you flip the page and then he's like, and then 1 year later, I was still the funniest, most misogynistic guy in the room. It's crazy. And that's the whole book. I read this interview with Jenijoy Labh, who was the first female professor at Caltech, and she tells a story about a night out with Feynman. And I remembered that Richard pretended all evening that he was French, and he spoke very bad French all evening. See the difference? Like, her version of the story, which I don't know, Jenijoy Labh, I assume she's telling the truth. So she says, Richard Feynman spoke in a funny French accent and pretended all night that he spoke bad French. And if we heard Feynman tell the story, I imagine it would go something like, I was the hottest guy with the hottest female professor at Caltech, and everyone thought I was a French prince, and we ran into some Canadians who spoke like Quebecois French, and they were so impressed with my accent, they thought I was a real French guy. I impressed everyone. Everyone thought I was French. That's the difference. Like, one of those is believable as a thing that happened. A man committed to the bit does a silly French accent all night versus what's in those books. So my second thing about all these stories, and like it's an evidence why I think they're not true, is it's that they don't sound believable. And when you think someone's not telling you the truth and then they tell a story that doesn't sound believable, you have a hard time believing it. Like the safe cracking thing. Richard Feynman talks a lot about how when he worked at Lannel, it wasn't very good security procedures, and like you could just get into the safes. And he tells different versions of this story. Like sometimes the safes have like a flaw in the bottom and you can just open them. Sometimes he can like listen and unlock them. And sometimes like he just magically hits it in the right order and it opens. There's this really weird video that Caltech made like a hologram of Feynman for his 100th birthday, and it looks like shit, and it's so disrespectful. I'll link it below, but he tells a version of the safe cracking story.
This drawer's locked. I can pick the lock easy. I open the lock right away. Pull out the drawer, look along the wood, nothing. Sorry. There's a lot of papers in the drawer. I fish around among the papers, and finally I find there's a nice little piece of paper, which is the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and so forth, carefully printed. The secretaries have to know how to make those letters and how to call them when they're talking about them, right? So they all had, each one had a copy of this thing. But carelessly scrawled across the top is pi is equal to 3.14159. So I go up to the safe, 31, 41, 59, doesn't open. 13, 14, 95, doesn't open. 95, 14, 13, doesn't open. 41, 31, 20 minutes, I'm turning pi upside down. It doesn't open. So I start walking out of the office. And I said, you know, but it's true. Psychologically, I'm right. Freddie de Hoffman is just the kind of a guy to use a mathematical constant for his safe combination. So the other important mathematical constant is E. So I walk back to the safes, 27, 18, 28, click, it opens.
But the thing is, I worked at Lannel briefly. I was like an intern, and it's a very secure facility. And I didn't have a security clearance, but I had a background check, right? And because I didn't have a security clearance, they were very clear with me on what I was allowed to do, where I was allowed to go. Like, the guards at Los Alamos have guns, and they're allowed to use them. And opening a safe you're not supposed to have access to is a crime, actually. Like, Feynman tells a story where it's like after the war, he goes back to Los Alamos and he goes into the director's office, I think it was the director, and he picks up a very important document that this guy just left out. You don't do that at a secure facility. I don't think so. And he hides it in the guy's safe, meaning he opens that safe, which could have been full of any other documents, and he put it in there. And the conclusion of the story is the guy's like freaking out, and Feynman's like, you'll lose something, haha. Anyway, him looking at that document, federal crime. Him opening the safe with all the other documents, federal crime. It doesn't even matter if Feynman had some sort of security clearance, because it's like you see classified information as like a need to know. He didn't need to know any of that. So the fact he was seeking it out, federal crime. I just don't believe he's just cavalierly doing this. And I don't believe that he did do it, because if he did do it, he would have gotten in trouble. Remember Ethel and Julian Rosenberg, they gave documents to the Soviets and they were murdered by the state. Like, I don't think Feynman's crime was the same, but like surely he would have been punished. I just don't believe this story. I just don't believe it. Surely it's just greatly exaggerated. I don't know, but there's another very similar story that's just unbelievable. He was working at Lano. They fly him to Oak Ridge, which is another national lab that was working on the Manhattan Project, and he just walks into the room and the engineers have like a big blueprint out and they're like, Mr. Feynman, could you find the problem with this blueprint? And he just like points to the problem and he's like, there you go. And they're like, whoa, you're a genius. Oh my, it's so cringy. It's so cringy that someone would write that down and think that it was believable, because like maybe you have one event like that in your life, but Feynman writes his memoir. Well, Feynman tells his memories to Ralph Leighton, who then records them and writes them down years later, as if every moment of Richard Feynman's life was one where he was the hero and he was the bestest boy and he did the bestest thing, and it's so embarrassing. And my third piece of evidence that none of these stories are true is that there's no physics in them. So Richard Feynman, he was a very famous physicist. He was hanging out with all the other very famous physicists all the time. Those were his colleagues. He went to meetings. He went to groups. He was on phone calls. They were publishing papers. He was giving lectures with very famous people, but also physicists who weren't famous, which means when Richard Feynman met those people, they would remember that event very clearly, right? Because meeting a famous person is exciting. So Richard Feynman, who was constantly around people that would remember meeting him, only tells stories in his memoir where he's in some random place where nobody knows who he is. It's like if Michael Jordan wrote a memoir called Tales from the Court, and none of it took place on America's basketball courts. Like the whole thing was just him going to countries where they don't do a lot of basketball, and him just like schooling children on basketball, just absolutely being the best basketball player. And he was like, man, see, I'm really good at basketball. If you read that, you would be like, what is this? Why didn't he? I should stop doing sports metaphors. Shaquille O'Neal, the Dream Team, that time he played baseball and did Space Jam, you would want that in the book, right? But there's no physics in the books. There's no physics in these books. He never referenced, like in this book, where Richard Feynman is doing a memoir, you might want him to maybe talk about what it was like to work with Einstein, what it was like to hear the Einstein speak. Einstein is name dropped once, and it's when Richard Feynman is just the bestest little baby boy, and he gives the best little colloquium ever to Albert Einstein. And it's just like, okay, but what else about Albert Einstein? Is that all you're going to say? Like, what is this? Also, in this little piece of evidence where it doesn't make sense, the one time Richard Feynman mentions a famous physicist, it's our boy Murray Gell-Mann, and Murray Gell-Mann was so offended by how the story was told and its inaccuracy that he threatened to sue, and the book is now released with a different version of that story because he told a not true story. I'm just saying, it's interesting how a very famous person with lots of very famous friends wrote a memoir that takes place mostly when he's on the road in remote locations talking to people who are not famous at all, even strangers that he doesn't really know. So even if you wanted to, like, I don't know, fact check the stories, you couldn't do it. So they're probably true, I guess, right? Except for that one with Gell-Mann, because you could immediately fact check one, and that one was proven to be false. So, also, like, you know the story, this was in the Oppenheimer movie, I think. I'm not going to watch it. I haven't seen it. I think this is in the Oppenheimer movie. Like, the guy who plays Feynman is sitting in the car, they're going to watch the blast. And he's like, the UV will protect my eyes. And Feynman tells this story all the time. And it's just that, like, everybody else was looking away. So, there's nobody to know if you did look or not. He's like the kid who cheats at Heads Up 7-Up. Like, I definitely looked at the blast. I did. I know no one else did because we were told not to, but I'm brave and strong and I'm not scared about my eyesight. I'm such a badass. Yeah, I did. I don't believe it, Richard Feynman. Honestly, this has been making me crazy. I've spent the last year overanalyzing every piece of information I've read about Richard Feynman because he's just over-exaggerating. He's a showman. He's constantly telling tales and you can't get a straight word out of him. Did he look at the blast? I mean, maybe. Did he call that woman a whore, which is the thing that started the video? I don't know. What? He says he did both things. He says he does a lot of things, but did he do those things? Because he's constantly telling stories that don't make sense, stories that can't be true, stories that, like, you would be embarrassed if someone kept telling you these fake stories and it's just like, yeah, of course he did, buddy, sure. I feel like I'm going crazy. I don't understand how, I've never heard anyone talk about this. I don't understand how the legend of Richard Feynman exists when he's just constantly bragging about the craziest things that obviously didn't happen. The fourth piece of evidence that all these stories are fake is Freeman Dyson. So Freeman Dyson, I read his memoir, or one of them, I think he's got multiple, but he is also in like the book of letters with Richard Feynman, and he also introduces a lot of these. I will get into Freeman Dyson's role in Feynman's physics later, but Freeman Dyson loves my hair. Freeman Dyson loves these books. He loves Surely You're Joking. And when he's introducing these books, he likes to talk about Surely You're Joking, and he always says, these stories, all of them true, which is not a thing you say if the stories are true. It's like that meme. You wouldn't constantly say, stories are definitely true, these stories are definitely true, if they were true. And also, in the book of letters, Freeman Dyson writes a letter to his parents about going out with Feynman to do a thing. And that event that he wrote a letter about was written about in Surely You're Joking, except it was told completely differently. And Freeman Dyson is like, the reason it's different is because I just wouldn't want my parents to know I went to a strip club, so that's probably why the stories differ. And I'm like, do the stories differ because you were embarrassed, or did someone make up a story and you thought that was a better story? Or maybe it's because it was 50 years ago and you just want to remember the cool version of the story. Like, and if you still don't believe me that the stories in these books are not true or exaggerated to the point of farce, I need to tell you that inside of this book, there is a story where Richard Feynman, Richard Feynman, goes to a bar in Canada. You've never heard of it. I'm just kidding. It was in upstate New York. You've never heard of it. And he gets in a fight, a physical fight, with a huge dude in the bathroom. And he goes back out and he finishes his whiskey. And that guy's buddies come over and I should just read it to you. It's ridiculous. You're not going to believe it. One time I was at the men's room of the bar and there was a guy at the urinal. He was kind of drunk. And he said to me in a mean-sounding voice, "I don't like your face. I think I'll punch it in." I was scared green. I replied in an equally mean voice, "Get out of my way or I'll pee right through you!" Exclamation point. He said something else, and I figured it was getting pretty close to a fight now. I'd never been in a fight. I didn't know what to do exactly, and I was afraid of getting hurt. I did think of one thing. I moved away from the wall because I figured if I got hit, I'd get hit from the back too. Then I felt a sort of funny crunching in my eye. It didn't hurt much, and the next thing I know, I'm slamming the son of a gun right back automatically. It was remarkable for me to discover that I didn't have to think. The machinery knew what to do. "Okay, that's 1 for 1, I said. "You want to keep on going?" The other guy backed off and left. We would have killed each other if the other guy was as dumb as I was. I went to wash up. My hands were shaking. Blood is leaking out of my gums. I've got a weak place in my gums, and my eye hurt. After I calmed down, I went back into the bar and swaggered up to the bartender. "Black and white, water on the side," I said. I figured it would calm my nerves. I didn't realize it, but the guy I socked in the men's room was over in another part of the bar talking with 3 other guys. Soon these 3 guys, big tough guys, came over to where I was sitting and leaned over me. They looked down threateningly and said, "What's the idea of picking a fight with our friend?" Well, I'm so dumb, I didn't realize I'm being intimidated. All I know is right and wrong. I simply whip around and snap at them. "Why don't you find out who started what first before you start making trouble?" The big guys were so taken aback by the fact that their intimidation didn't work that they backed away and left. In this book, Richard Feynman tells the story of how he beat up a huge tough guy in a bar, and his 3 big guy tough friends come to fight him, and he showed him how tough he was. That's a story that definitely happened. That's a true story from this book. I take no pleasure in this. I find this incredibly cringy. At first, I thought he was a sexist asshole, but then it's really just him making up stories because he's trying to impress some dude 30 years younger with how manly he is. And to do that, he's making up stories where he gets in fights and he negs women and he meets guys called the Master. It's pathetic. It's sad. Like, obviously Richard Feynman is very successful and interesting, right? Why did he feel the need to do this? He constantly goes to strip clubs and he does art, but only of naked women, and he's just always making up these stories. I know earlier I was talking about gender, and I talked about how this book is damaging for women in physics, but now let's just think about what this does for men. The biography talks a lot about how as a child and young man, Richard Feynman felt like a sissy. He felt embarrassed of his size. He was worried about coming off. This guy says sissy, but it feels like he was worried about being seen as gay or something because Richard Feynman was not gay, which I guess in the early 1900s would be a thing. But Feynman kind of spends his whole life worrying about how other people are perceiving his manliness, right? And it just seems not to have gone away as he grew up. Like, in this book, these stories were told when he was 50. He was 50 years old and still concerned with how manly he appeared. He wanted to pretend to be an alpha male. He always goes to strip clubs. He constantly talks about how beautiful women are and how he wants to draw on naked ladies. And it's just... Did I mention he makes up a story in this book about meeting a pickup artist called the Master? It's like a 13-year-old boy's version of what happens at a strip club. Richard Feynman is 50 years old, and he's just like, I know a guy who slept with 100 women one time. It's weird. Just, it's sad. It's devastating. Like, Richard Feynman was not secure enough in his manliness to just vibe and be happy. And now we hand this book to every 13-year-old with a passing interest in physics and just doom them to the same fate. How is this happening? Ralph Leighton, how did you write these stories down and publish them all together and be like, did it? How are you still publishing this book? This book is still in print. How is it released unedited? We're giving talks 40 years later about the context of this book as if this whole time you still think these are true. This is factual events. Like, imagine you're 50 years old and you go to, I don't know, like a book club and you meet a 20-year-old lady and you like hit it off and you're like friends. You know, intergenerational friendships are great. And you go to this book club for 15 years and you're excited to see your friend. She comes over for Christmas. You guys are like actual friends. And then you die. And then you're in heaven. And 40 years in the future, you look down from heaven and you see your friend, and her entire life, the next 40 years, she has spent shilling books about your life, giving talks about your life. Her career is now just talking about that brief period where you were friends. What is happening? Who is in charge of Richard Feynman's legacy? Who gets to pick how you're remembered? All right, Angela, you're doing a really good job. No one can tell that you got super frustrated and had to stop filming, and it's now the next day. No one can tell. It's fine. So, let's talk about the Ralph Leighton of it all. So, Ralph Leighton wrote these books. Ralph Leighton was friends with Richard Feynman. I assumed that Ralph Leighton was like a journalist and he wanted to write books, which is why he wrote these books, because books about, you know, a genius will sell. So while I was going through thrift books and buying just anything vaguely related to Richard Feynman, I saw another book by Ralph Leighton called Tuva or Bust. And I just ordered it. I was like, oh, Tuva, I looked it up, is this country near Mongolia. It's part of Russia now. And I was like, oh, he must have gone to Tuva. Ralph Leighton is a journalist. He wrote a book about that. And Ralph Leighton seemed important to the lore of the legend of Richard Feynman. So I just ordered it and forgot about it. So I'm waiting for all these books to come in. I read this book. I read the sequel. I read this book. I realize these are by Ralph Leighton and Richard Feynman never wrote a book. I'm waiting for all these books to arrive in the mail, and Tuva or Bust shows up. And when I tell you, I opened that package and I gasped because, I have to show you actually. This is what the cover of Tuva or Bust looks like. It's just a picture of Richard Feynman. It says Richard Feynman's Last Journey. Richard Feynman never went to Tuva. Ralph Leighton just only writes about Richard Feynman. Feynman wanted to go to Tuva. They briefly talked about it. And while Ralph Leighton is doing all this Tuva stuff, Richard Feynman is really busy, with dying of cancer and also doing the Challenger Disaster Committee thing. So Ralph Leighton's book, pictures of Feynman all over it, Richard Feynman's Last Journey. But this is not really the story of Richard Feynman. This is a Ralph Leighton story that Richard Feynman is just like adjacent. But if you were to look at it, you would think, oh, this is a book about Richard Feynman. Almost like intentionally they want to make you think this is about Richard Feynman when it's not. So this book is barely relevant to this video. Apparently Richard Feynman and Ralph Leighton had talked about Tuva, and in this book Ralph Leighton is trying to set up a trip to Tuva for him and the Feynmans because like Gwyneth, his wife, is this huge traveler. And this book is actually much more interesting. In this book, there are like daily accounts of what relations between America and the USSR were. It's just an interesting, I think, like historical document, this book. And I enjoyed reading it much more than any other product of Ralph Leighton, but it has nothing to do with Richard Feynman. Absolutely nothing to do with Richard Feynman. He is barely in this book. He is barely a character. And like, I think this book would have done better if it was presented as what it is, as an interesting document about someone trying to go to a place that Russia is like, probably you better not. So it was okay. This book was okay. It is interesting to see someone who I learned is a former California public schools teacher, Ralph Leighton, be super sympathetic to Ronald Reagan. Like, really? Really? It's signed. Signed by one Mr. Ralph Leighton, so, a collector's item now. I was shocked to see that this is advertised. This whole thing is written as if it's about Richard Feynman when it's not. And it seems like Ralph Leighton does everything with respect to his friendship with Richard Feynman. I mean, relatively recently, he released a children's book that was also about Richard Feynman. He makes YouTube videos addressed to Richard Feynman's spirit.
Hey, Chief! I can't believe you're here!
I mean, it's weird. It's weird. But who am I to judge, right? Because if you watch my channel for the past year, I sure do mention Richard Feynman a lot. Look at all these books I've read about Richard Feynman. I have the same sickness. Once Richard Feynman is in your brain, you can't stop trying to figure it out. Who is Richard Feynman? Why was he so obsessed with curating this image of being an asshole and a pathetic loser? And why would he tell fake stories? And why were the fake stories still published? And it never ends for me. I need help because I can't stop thinking about this either. Me and Ralph Leighton, we're on the same journey spiritually, I think. Someone help. I need help. If you ever hear Ralph Leighton talk, because he still goes around and gives talks about Richard Feynman, he will talk about the late, great Richard Feynman, the best physicist to ever exist, and they don't make physicists like him anymore. He is the greatest example of what a physicist is. There's no one like him. And I thought that was kind of insulting, like, to the field. Like, I don't think I'm like Richard Feynman, of course not, but there are definitely physicists alive today, working today, who are very much just as skilled at physics as Richard Feynman. Of course, like there's a whole range of skill levels, and there are very, very good, hardworking physicists today who are just as good at math and science as Richard Feynman. It's like a little insulting. It reminds me of that introduction by Professor Anthony Z where he called us all dull as dishwashers. Like, what are you talking about? You don't know. What do you mean Richard Feynman is the only good physicist to ever exist? And that's when I realized something else. Ralph Leighton, 20-year-old man, is somehow introduced to Richard Feynman, 50-year-old man, professor of physics at Caltech. And if you're a careful viewer of my channel with a really good memory, you might remember this video where I talked about Bob Leighton, famous physicist who worked at Caltech. You see, Bob Leighton, father of Ralph Leighton, introduced his son to Richard Feynman, also a physicist at Caltech. Bob Leighton, friend, colleague, collaborator of Richard Feynman, is the father of Ralph Leighton. Actually, Bob Leighton is one of the 3 authors on the Feynman lectures. Actually, Bob Leighton probably deserves more credit than Richard Feynman himself for writing the Feynman lectures, because you see, Richard Feynman delivered most of the Feynman lectures. Some of them were guest lectures, and then he went off on sabbatical or whatever, and Bob Leighton took the audio, went through and wrote a transcript, went through and drew diagrams, went through and fact-checked, went through and wrote problems, did all the math. Bob Leighton is the author of those Feynman lectures that everyone is so happy about, and everyone is like, wow, Feynman is such a great teacher. That's a Bob Leighton joint. So Bob Leighton, famous physicist, professor at Caltech, introduces his son Ralph Leighton to Richard Feynman, also famous physicist and professor at Caltech. And Ralph Leighton spends the next 40 years of his life talking about how there's only one good physicist, and it's Richard Feynman. No brain like him exists anymore. Richard Feynman is the greatest physicist of all time, the greatest physicist to ever exist. They don't just make him like Richard Feynman. No one can ever live up to being a good physicist like Richard Feynman. Ralph Leighton, son of Bob Leighton, famous physicist, said that, and still says it all the time. Listen, I don't want to presume anything about their relationship, but if my child looked at me and said, you're not like a real scientist though, and then made a whole career, spent their entire life talking about how actually I knew the only good physicist and it certainly wasn't you, it was this guy, I would feel devastated. Ralph Leighton, son of Bob Leighton, famous, incredible scientist. Richard Feynman is the only good scientist. And like, it almost feels pointed. Once you realize the connection of Bob Leighton to Ralph Leighton, those comments about how Feynman's the only good one really feel pointed. They feel mean. They feel like you're supposed to realize that Bob Leighton is the father of Ralph Leighton, because they seem like they're on purpose. And I don't know, maybe Bob Leighton was a dick, and maybe those comments are very specifically to say Richard Feynman, because like, Ralph Leighton essentially joins Feynman's family. Like, they go on vacations together. Ralph Leighton asked Richard Feynman to be the best man at his wedding, and he was. So, like, maybe you do need to presume something about the relationship. And then I was like, oh, well, maybe Bob Leighton died. And maybe Feynman, like, stepped into that role of father. But Bob Leighton died 10 years after Feynman. So Bob Leighton definitely spent the last 10 years of his life seeing his son say Richard Feynman is the only good physicist, even though he was in fact also a very famous physicist. I don't know. Maybe they didn't like each other. I don't know. But I do take umbrage. Is that a thing you're allowed to say? Am I using that word correctly? Umbrage with the fact that Bob Leighton would be considered not a good physicist. Bob Leighton is an amazing, famous physicist who contributed to lots of different fields and had an amazing career. And actually, even before I knew or discovered or realized, it took me an embarrassing long time to realize Ralph Leighton, Bob Leighton, because I don't know, Ralph Leighton never talks about him, never talks about his father, the famous physicist. So it took me a long time. But once I got there, I realized, Oh, I love Bob Leighton. I had actually been planning to do a whole video separately on Bob Leighton because of this interview I read with him. I'm gonna find it. Hang on, I'll read it to you. And it's published on the American Institute of Physics website. It's like an oral history of people's career. And I've been thinking about this quote for like 18 months because it just really resonated with me. I'm gonna read it to you. Hang on. I have always shied away from things where I felt that if I did something or didn't do something, the next week it would be done by somebody else anyway. The corollary to that is that if you have to feel if we don't measure this today, Jones and Brown are going to measure it tomorrow and then they'll beat us out. I don't like to be in that kind of an endeavor because it isn't so much that I don't like competition so much as I think it's a waste. Unless, of course, you don't get the same results and then you can argue about something. But that's something else. I mean, if you're always pushing because these guys are going to get ahead of us or something like that, I think you're in the wrong field. Or at least I feel like I'm in the wrong field. So I've always tried to do things where I could have the feeling that if I didn't do it, it wouldn't be done for quite a while. It's kind of nice to work that way. I guess I'm just too much of an individualist or something for some of the group things. And yet some of the things I've done have been very much team efforts. So I don't know, but I consciously try to avoid situations where you're competing against some specific other people, working with essentially the same resources or the same ideas and so on like that. And I think this is just so interesting. So to me, Bob Leighton is kind of painting these pictures of two types of physicists. You have the Feynmans and the Gell-Manns, who are working at the forefront of the field, but they're doing identical experiments at Caltech, identical work at Caltech to people at Princeton are doing, or at CERN are doing. And everyone's rushing to try and be the first one to finish the experiment, to be the first, they're theorists, but you get it, the first one to get the result. And if CERN gets the result before you, it is like they get all the credit, even if you're 4 days later and you get the same result. So what you're working on is really this competition. And you guys are doing the same experiment. You have the same idea. And Bob Leighton suggests that he doesn't like that type of work and he would much rather do something because it's interesting, do something because it hasn't been done and nobody's working on it. And maybe, just maybe, you will discover something amazing. You will work out something that no one has seen before, but the work you're doing needs to be done also, if only to support the work of these people at the forefront racing against each other who are like funded by competition. And I think that's so interesting. Both of these groups are obviously important. Like, we need both. But I kind of also, I'm the type of guy that's like I'm a Bob Leighton style, physicist. Like, I want to work because I'm interested in the problem. I don't want to work because I'm worried someone else is going to get ahead of me, And we need both. And both are great, I think. And Bob Leighton is just like, I'm this type of guy. And he goes on to talk about funding, about how like maybe it is wasteful for the US government, for example, to fund Caltech and Princeton to do the same experiment when they could just be working together. I think it's something to think about. I should also say, Bob Leighton, even though he's claiming to be this type of physicist that I think I am, I think Bob Leighton is an amazing physicist. He's very much closer to being a Richard Feynman than I am close to being a Bob Leighton, if you know what I mean. It's probably a log scale, but I just think it's a really nice idea. I like the way he's proud of the work he's done. And if you look at Bob Leighton's like CV and his papers, he works in particle physics, he works in stars, he works in instrumentation. Like, he just kind of went where he wanted to go to do what he wanted to do. And I think that is also an amazing career, worthy of respect. I don't know where to go from here. Like, I started out wanting to understand the legend of Richard Feynman. And I learned that those books are not written by Richard Feynman, and also those stories are not real. And also those stories are written by a guy who very specifically, because of family matters I'm not going to get into, seems to have a beef with physicists. So the legend of Richard Feynman is written by a guy who's not a physicist and also doesn't seem to like physicists. So like, what is the point of that book? I'm gonna be honest, I'm kind of mad about it. Why is this still published? Why was this ever published in the first place? Richard Feynman did not write this. Why is it published as if he wrote this? And why is this still published without front matter describing the damage this does to women in physics? Why is this still published as if this has value, especially when you realize from reading all the Feynman stuff that Richard Feynman himself later would talk a lot about how what he said in this book was inappropriate and audiences would not like it. And he also changed the way he talked about women in his lectures. Where's the computer book? So in this book, it's lectures on computation. And in this book at the start, he talks about like an accountant. And he's like, so imagine you have an accountant and this guy. And then he says like, oh, like the gender doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And like maybe he's being a dick. Maybe he's like making fun of the woke people who have complained about how in the Feynman lectures, he has an example with a woman who's a bad driver. But this shows progress. This shows that he realized it's inappropriate to do that. So why is this book still published as if Richard Feynman didn't understand that it was inappropriate to behave this way? Why? Why? It's just, it doesn't make sense to me that this book is published unedited. Like you could just take this book and shove Leila McNeill's essay, Surely You're a Creep, Richard Feynman, at the start. You could just talk about the recent and ongoing sexual assault and harassment of women and just say how this impacts that and how it's still happening and how it's not a thing that happened in the 80s, it's a thing that happened today. I made a video about it. Don't watch it. It's depressing as fuck. Just condemn this behavior in any way at all in this book. This book just like, these are crazy stories, right? Remember that time he poured water all over a waitress? LOL. Like, what? How is it still happening like this? Like, you know when you watch Aladdin on Disney Plus and a little placard pops up and it's like, hey, some of this is actually pretty insensitive. Like, what a nice little learning moment. Just shove that in the front. Like, what is this? Let me give you a specific example of what I mean when I say it should be edited and not just removing all the exclamation points. So, in the sequel book, which was published after Feynman died, by the way, so he didn't get to read this, there is this story. Hang on, let me find it for you. So in this sequel book, there's this story written by Ralph Leighton, obviously from tapes where Richard Feynman is telling this story, called Feynman's Sexist Pig! Exclamation point, of course. This story takes place after the Feynman lectures are published, and there's an example problem where the woman is a bad driver and she gets pulled over by a cop, and people are like, this is sexist. And I'm pretty sure they probably weren't mad about that problem. They were more mad about the harassment to the students, but like whatever. And so they find out Feynman's giving a speech, and this women's group shows up to protest with signs that say Feynman's a sexist pig. And Feynman goes up to give his speech, and the people walk in, and let me just read you directly because I don't want to misquote Ralph Leighton because it's not written by Richard Feynman. Here's Feynman giving the speech. Even though the American Association of Physics Teachers has given me an award for teaching, I must confess I don't know how to teach. Therefore, I have nothing to say about teaching. Instead, I would like to talk about something that will be especially interesting to the women in the audience. I would like to talk about the structure of the proton. The protesters put their picket signs down and walked off. You get it? Because, like, they don't care about physics because they're just dumb. Just women are so stupid. They don't want to hear about the world-leading expert on what's going on in a proton talk about a proton. Like, of course not, because women are stupid. But the thing that gets me about this specific story, which is obviously not true, is that in the text, they admit that it's not true. Well, Ralph Leighton admits that it's not true. So there's parentheses, and it says, recently I discovered a transcript. By the way, Feynman is dead. Why is this written as if he's talking? It kills me. Okay. Parentheses, recently I discovered a transcript of my speech, and what I said at the beginning doesn't seem anywhere near as dramatic as the way I remember it. What I remember saying is much more wonderful, really, than what I actually said! Exclamation point. So, here's the thing. I assume Ralph Leighton had the transcript of the speech, and he realized that other people could also look it up. And he realized that people would realize these stories were fake. It's the only possible clue. And so he mentions like, oh, it's not what was actually said. But here's the thing about the story. Like, wouldn't this be a perfect time to put a little asterisk and write what Richard Feynman actually said? Because surely you know what he actually said, because he didn't say this. He didn't say this. So what did he say? I tried to find it. I couldn't find it. But this is what I'm talking about. It's a fake story. And the goal of the story, the punchline of the story is like, isn't Feynman the smartest guy in the room and women are so stupid? But you know the story is not true. So why would you publish this story at all? It's a not true story. It's garbage. It doesn't make any sense to me. Also, I'm sure I've put up the text, like a picture of the text. Someone please just notice the number of exclamation points. Like, what is happening? This isn't how you write things. I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop mentioning the exclamation points. But I do want to say this should at least, like the lowest bar is on the floor, this should not be published as if it's written by Richard Feynman, because it's not. This should not say by Richard Feynman. This should say stories told to Ralph Leighton, written by Ralph Leighton from Richard Feynman. And that's it, okay? This just seems like false advertising. Are you just allowed to do this? Like, I know some books have ghostwriters, but are you allowed to just be like, oh, it's an autobiography, not written by him? Because, like, that's the definition of autobiography. It doesn't make any sense. And this obviously, it does make sense, though. Like, fiscally. These books are unedited, full of casual sexism, full of stories that are obviously not true, but they sell really well, right? So why not take these two books and put them into a single volume and sell them again? Sell them again as if it's just a different book, because people would buy it, right? Man, you know these Feynman lectures? 3 volumes, all separately purchased. These really sell well. What if, I don't know, we just took random pieces of those and published them in smaller little books as if it was new content, even though it's just the same exact content put in here? What if we took those same Feynman lectures and made a special little Millennium box set that sells for like $150, even though it's the same material? I actually don't know what was in here. I bought this used, so I don't think we can repackage the Feynman lectures anymore and sell them again. We already do that like 6 different times. What if we made a book of problem sets? That would be fun. The problems in here are actually really nice. It's not written by Richard Feynman. This came out a few years ago. The man died in 1988. Why are you pretending? It's not written by Richard Feynman. Just tell the truth. Like, what's wrong with you people? Oh, here's Bob Leighton. You can see he's the second author on all these. Bob Leighton is also dead, by the way. He did not write this either. Like, what are you doing? Well, we can't sell any more copies of the Feynman lectures probably, right? But what if we compiled a new document called Feynman's Tips on Physics? And really, it's just written by one of the guy who's still alive, Matt Gottlieb, I think, who worked on the Feynman lectures, and Ralph Leighton himself, to talk about how the Feynman lectures were written. In this book, there's an interview with Bob Leighton, and he talks about how Feynman was super hands-off because he didn't write that book at all. So in this book, they admit that Richard Feynman didn't write the Feynman lectures. He just gave most of the lectures. Again, a lot of them were guest lectures. And yet they still pretend that this is by Richard Feynman. Feynman is dead. He didn't write this. He didn't write this, though, actually. What is happening? What if we wrote a biography even though it's been a single year since the last and definitive biography of Richard Feynman came out? Have I mentioned I love how this book starts with, we probably don't need another biography of Richard Feynman? No, Gribbons, you don't. We don't, actually. What if we had famed sex pest Lawrence Krauss write another biography of Richard Feynman? Surely we need another one, right? I didn't give Lawrence Krauss any money for this, but I felt bad even buying it used. But not as bad as I felt reading it, because he's terrible at writing science. But bump. What if we had AI scrape the 3 biographies that exist, and then we published like a children's version that was printed so shittily, and it's obviously just copied that this should be, I don't know, the money for this should go to James Gleek. This is garbage trash. I had to get this one on Amazon because like Amazon just prints it, and I didn't realize it was AI garbage. But I should have, because look at this. That's awful. Who are you, Alexander Rowe? Stop pretending to be a writer. How about that? What if we published a book of quotes? And what if, funnily enough, a lot of these quotes came from all these books, which, you know, Richard Feynman didn't write. So, like, they're not actually quotes from Richard Feynman, but we don't acknowledge that anywhere in this book. What if we did that? Also, who is this for? Who is just reading Richard Feynman quotes? Like, who actually is this for? So I worked next to Richard Feynman for like a year, and I had 3 or 4 short conversations with him, which I recorded like a psycho. Could I write a book and profit off those brief interactions? So, like 20 years ago, we took a course, a graduate level course on gravitation given by Richard Feynman, and we took notes on that course. What if we took our notes 10 years after Feynman died and rewrite them to make it sound like Feynman himself is delivering a lecture, and then we published it and said it was by Richard Feynman? What if we did that? People would buy that, right? Okay, this one I didn't purchase because I knew that it was not written by Richard Feynman. Before I knew all of these were not written by Richard Feynman. And it's various different books and articles and like podcasts and like inspirational YouTube videos called The Feynman Technique. The Feynman Technique for physics, and it doesn't exist. People will just say like, here's the Feynman Technique for doing physics first. You learn something. And then you try to explain it to someone else. And if you mess it up, you learn it again. And then you can try to simplify it so you're really good at explaining it. And it's just like, that's just learning. That's not the Feynman technique. That's literally just learning. How did people they just slap Feynman's name on it and they're like, Richard Feynman, famous genius. Here are his tips for learning, which include just learning. I don't understand. But at least I didn't pay money for it. Score 1 for Angela, the only one in this video, actually. That's my only point. I'm the loser. I lost. The Feynman year of how I lost a year of my life. It's fine. Okay, so here's the most egregious one. It's called Feynman's Lost Lecture, and it's written by David Goodstein and Judith Goodstein. And it's a companion audio CD and a book. This is called Feynman's Lost Lecture because after Feynman died, it seems as if everyone started scraping through their office for any remnant of interacting with Richard Feynman so that they could then write a book and publish and profit off that brief interaction. In this book, they talked to Ralph Leighton, and he had an audio recording of this lecture, which is like the motions of the planets around the sun. It's an undergrad lecture without calculus, and it's a geometry-based argument for the law of ellipses. Okay, so they had the audio for it, but this is a very diagram-heavy talk, and so it took a lot of work that the Goodsteins spend a lot of detail talking about how much work, how long it took to listen to the audio tape and then transcribe it and then figure out what the diagrams were doing so that they could put them in the book. Like, aren't the Goodsteins heroes for finding this lost lecture, this geometric argument for the law of ellipses that would have been lost to time if they didn't find it? That's how this book is sold. And this lecture, it's interesting, it's fine. The Minute Physics video I clipped earlier is 3 blue, 1 brown doing this. It's good. I'll link that video below. But the problem for me is how this book is sold. Let me read to you from the epilogue. Richard Feynman conjured up his own brilliant proof of the law of ellipses, but he was not the first to think of it. The same proof, right down to the crucial insight of turning the velocity diagram on his side, the same exact proof appears in a little book called Matter and Motion, written by James Clerk Maxwell. You know, Einstein, Newton, Maxwell, that Maxwell. Maxwell attributes the method of proof to Sir William Hamilton. You know Hamilton. A name familiar to all physicists. So, the Goodsteins present this idea that, oh my gosh, Richard Feynman had a unique and interesting way to solve this problem. And then they drop in the 11th hour that like, oh, by the way, it's 100% identical to something that appears in a paper written by Maxwell. Goodsteins, do you think that Feynman is unfamiliar with Maxwell? Feynman, famously well-read, famously famous for reading papers and then working them out so that he remembers the proofs. Richard Feynman, in his lost lecture, thank God we saved his derivation, is giving Maxwell's lecture. And let me just say, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with Feynman doing that, because when you are a professor and you have students that are in a class, the students understand that the professor is not single-handedly deriving every little thing. They are working from notes, they are working from textbooks, and I'm sure in the syllabus of this course, Feynman was like, here's an argument on the law of ellipses presented by Maxwell, and yet the Goodsteins present it as if like, whoa, what a genius. Isn't it crazy that it's the same thing as Maxwell? That's wild. No, it's not crazy, because Richard Feynman is incredibly well-read. Richard Feynman is incredibly good at reading papers and recognizing fun little things to do in class, because he's also a good teacher. Richard Feynman just gave Maxwell's presentation, and again, that's totally fine. What's not fine is the way you're presenting this, because when you write a book, which is why all of these books vary so much in quality, you have to find the source of what Feynman had in his brain, and that's difficult. So some of these books are pretty shitty, and they present all these ideas as if Feynman came up with them, but some of them are very good, like the one on computation. I like that one. And they are sourcing the information of all the things Feynman is saying, because a reader, unlike a student in a class, a reader of a book that says by Richard Feynman is going to assume that every piece of information was actually by Richard Feynman. So you, as the editors, or the authors, I mean, who can say, of this book, need to make it clear at the start that Maxwell was responsible for this proof. Or Maxwell's paper is responsible. He cites Hamilton as the source. You need to say that. This is a lie. Obviously, it's because we found a tape of Richard Feynman delivering a lecture that's been delivered to every elementary physics class since the 1870s. It's not nearly as interesting as Richard Feynman's lost lecture. This is lying. It's just lying. It's not very nice. And don't worry, the profits from this book go towards the Caltech Research Fund, and it's probably definitely because Caltech owns all the Feynman material, and it has nothing to do with whether or not the Goodsteins wanted to profit off this. Who knows? I have a problem, right? I started this whole project thinking, oh my god, I hate Richard Feynman, he's such an asshole, and realizing, but that doesn't make sense. I don't know anything about Richard Feynman. And now I'm here? Like, Richard Feynman never wrote a book. Richard Feynman constantly made up stories. He was a showman. Does anybody know anything about Richard Feynman? Can you hate a guy that doesn't exist? The legend of Richard Feynman is based on nothing about Feynman at all. What's happening? This is such an unsatisfying ending, right? This is the end? Like, okay, he is an asshole in the stories, but he made up the stories. And also, by the way, he didn't write any of these books. And also, by the way, all of the people who worked with him just spend the rest of their lives trying to profit off the legacy of Richard Feynman, which doesn't exist, which seems pretty shitty. It just seems not fair and not nice. And now people like me just hate Richard Feynman because of this. But he didn't do that. So instead, I want to end by talking about everything I learned about Richard Feynman, and I want to split it into two sections. The first section, I want to talk about Richard Feynman the man, like what I learned about his personality based on his actions, based on what I presume are true stories told by his family and friends, and not the stories from Richard Feynman himself. And as a kind of fun little irony, because I've spent this whole time talking about the legend of Richard Feynman hasn't anything to do with physics, I'm gonna wait till the very end to talk about the other part of Richard Feynman's life, his approach to physics. I don't have 12 hours to actually just explain all the physics he did to you, but also I've already done that on my channel. Watch this video, or like I have 4 videos on antimatter. And also my Patreon video for this month is going to be about helium, and I am obviously, because I can never stop talking about Richard Feynman, going to talk about his quantum helium work. Maybe I'll publish that video here as like a little teaser for what my Patreon is usually like. I do an extra science video a month. They get to vote on the topic. We all have a good time. It's very fun. Okay, so instead, in the physics section, I want to talk about some of the physics stuff he did, but I want to talk about it specifically like his approach to physics. Because oh my god, I gotta stop. I am so surprised that these stacks of books have not fallen yet, because we hand this book to every 12-year-old who's like passively interested in physics, and we're like, this is what's being a physicist is like, and it's just not. So instead, I am going to talk about Feynman's approach to physics, why I think, personally, Feynman was such a good physicist, the traits that he had, the way he worked, that made him such a brilliant physicist. And now here's where I realize I am very specifically creating a legend of Richard Feynman. You can't put a person on a YouTube video. I am going to tell you what I think should be included in the legend of Richard Feynman when you tell it to young men and young women who want to be physicists, because you want them to grow up to be a good physicist, right? You don't want them to grow up to be a guy who thinks it's cool that he had a friend called the Master that told him how to nag the ladies into submission. So obviously you can't talk about everything in a man's life. I'm just going to do a brief little list of the things I think are interesting, the things I think we should probably tell people what's in the legend of Richard Feynman before they start worshiping this guy. This list is going to seem like it's all over the place, but that's fine. It's on a journey. We're on this ride. Let's hit it. Let's go. The first thing I want to talk about is his teaching. So Richard Feynman is known as this amazing teacher. That's why the Feynman lectures are so popular, even though they're not written by Richard Feynman. However, there's this quote from Ralph Leighton where he describes Feynman talking to like the public as like a Chinese food meal. Like, Richard Feynman is so infectiously excited about the material, and he's also so intelligent, and he's having a great time that he can convince you, the audience, that because you're also excited, because he's excited, you're also really intelligent on this topic. And then you go home and like 2 hours later you try to tell a friend what happened and you can't do it. Because Richard Feynman is so smart, he convinced you were smart. I've had professors like this before. That's why I failed organic chemistry. And the thing is, I don't think that makes him a bad teacher. I think Feynman's best work at teaching was showing up and being excited and convincing people that they will have a good time learning physics. Like, you can listen to the audio tapes of the actual lectures that he gave for the Feynman lectures, and you can feel the energy in the room.
Now, if the world of nature is made of atoms, and we too are made of atoms that obey physical laws, there's obvious distinction between what happened, the past and the future, and this obvious irreversibility of all phenomena, you would think would most likely have obviously its interpretation in that some laws, some of the motion laws of the atoms are going one way, that the atom laws are not such that they can go either way.
Everyone is having a good time. They are excited to be there learning the material because Richard Feynman was a really good teacher. Also, I said my experience in undergrad really painted Richard Feynman for me in a negative light, but just after undergrad, I went and got a master's of education so I could teach high school, and I did teach high school very briefly. And I remember reading an article about teaching in Brazil. And in this story, Richard Feynman is teaching these brilliant students, and he's asking them to solve problems. And he's asking them, like, do you know this equation? And they know all the answers. They can all say it out loud. They've got everything memorized. And then he asks them a practical question, like, describe light bouncing off the ocean. Like, what do you see? And they cannot answer it because they've memorized the equations. They've memorized the definitions of words, but they have no practical experience with physics. And Feynman, in this essay, uses this event to talk about the importance of demonstration in physics education. And I don't care if that story is fake. I like that idea, which I assume is Richard Feynman's ideas that he told to Ralph Leighton. I like the idea of approaching physics from practical demonstrations rather than just sitting and memorizing things because they want you to be smart in the future. Because memorizing a physics equation has nothing to do with whether or not you know where to apply it. And that convinced me, like, oh, I really do like teaching physics. I love talking about physics. Maybe I could be a teacher like Richard Feynman. And I taught high school, briefly. In these books, we can tell that Feynman did a lot of work with the local school districts in the Caltech area. And obviously the stories he tells are very exaggerated about how he's always the hero and he does these punchy one-liners, and I'm sure that it didn't happen that way. But he did, in fact, work with the public school districts. He often would give talks to high school students. He would go judge science fairs. Like, he was very involved with science education at multiple levels, and he did not have to do that. He was famous. He was wealthy. He did not have to invest the time that he did, and I find that very admirable, that someone would be so passionate about physics education that they would take the time to actually be there and support it in their community. Professors don't have a lot of free time, and in the book of letters, I don't know if I've held it up, it's this one, Perfectly Reasonable Deviations from Some, it's fine. It's a book of letters compiled by Michelle Feynman, his daughter, and in it, there's a bunch of examples of like 18-year-olds or undergrads and freshmen writing him letters and being like, can I have some advice? And he replies. It's just really nice. It's really nice to do that. I like that. So number 2, something I think that stands out when you watch interviews with Richard Feynman and stuff is that he's a huge contrarian. Contrarian. You know what? I'm going to say it how I say it, and it's fine. I think the Challenger Disaster Commission episode is the best example of this. So Challenger explodes, and this is before I was born, but if you were alive at the time, this is a formative event in your life. Like, this is the JFK assassination, or for us, it's 9/11. This is a huge event.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
NASA loses all communication with Challenger, but the crowd still does not realize that something's gone wrong. Within seconds, Challenger disintegrates.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
For the spectators and Krista McAuliffe's parents, joy turns to confusion, worry, and a realization of tragedy. The $1.2 billion spaceship, its 7 crew members, and their satellite payload disappear.
I thought the flight was going fine. And then I heard them say, major malfunction. And then the person beside me said it's exploded. And it was, I couldn't speak.
All over the news for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the government formed this little team to investigate NASA for what happened, because it should not have happened. And they needed a physicist uninvolved with the space administration to go do that. Feynman does it, even though at the time he's dying from cancer. It seems like he had this contrarian disagreement with the government and how it functions and how it funds science, which I'm sure a lot of the Feynman bros really like. Whatever. But what I find interesting is that it's almost like he does it out of spite. Like, the government is trying to force him to do the investigation the way they want him to do it, and he's just like, absolutely not. Anyway, the story goes that he's interviewing all these people that the government and also NASA don't want him to talk to. He's like down on the ground talking to engineers, and he's asking like, these calculations that you do to predict the statistical likelihood of failure on like a day, how are those done? Like, what factors go into that? And he's just like really trying to figure it out. And then he gets a call from the general, I don't know how to pronounce his name, the general who was also on the committee. And the general is like, hey man, I've been thinking about these O-rings on my car. You know, O-rings, do they care about the weather? Because Challenger exploded on a day when it was very cold and they shouldn't have launched. And now we're in the future, and we know that the general had that information because Sally Ride, American hero, NASA astronaut, like anonymously told him that information, or wished to remain anonymous because she did not want to receive retribution from NASA because she wanted to keep her job. But Sally Ride was an astronaut and an engineer. She knew about O-rings. She tells the general. The general calls Feynman, and he's kind of like, hey, what about this? And Feynman he's a practical person. He's a demonstrator. He gets the O-rings, he puts them in some ice water, he tests them, and he's like, oh shit, this is it. And then, live on TV, this is an amazing moment. Live on TV, he's just got a glass of ice water while the press is interviewing this committee, and he's like, put an O-ring in, and he's like, see? And everyone's like, oh shit.
And I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it maintains, it doesn't stretch back, it stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees. I believe that has some significance for our problem.
And I think some people think that Richard Feynman showed up at NASA and was like, I see the problem. Probably because in the book, he tells that story about going to Oak Ridge and looking at a huge blueprint and being like, here's your problem. But that's not a true story. The O-ring story is a true story, and he was given a tip from Sally Ride through to the general to Feynman. I don't think that piece of information discounts the contrarian element of Richard Feynman doing this live on TV without warning the press, without warning the committee, without warning NASA or the US government. He just did it. And that's pretty cool. I like it. I don't think knowing Sally Ride was responsible for the information makes any difference to how cool the story is. And I feel like that story should be in the legend of Richard Feynman, and maybe not the ones where he's always the only hero, the only person to know information. He got the information from someone else, and he still did it. And it's pretty cool. Once you notice Richard Feynman is just always being a contrarian, you can't stop noticing it. Like the teeth question. He wouldn't let the teeth thing drop, even though he wasn't trying to talk about teeth. There's a video from the interview with Christopher Sykes, the book, the documentary, No Ordinary Genius. And Christopher Sykes is like, hey, can you explain magnetic fields? And Richard Feynman is just so needlessly annoyed with how he asked the question that he doesn't answer the question.
What is it, the feeling between those two magnets?
What do you mean, what's the feeling between the two magnets?
There's something there, isn't there? I mean, the sensation is that there's something there when you push these two magnets together.
Listen to my question. What is the meaning when you say that there's a feeling? Of course you feel it. Now, what do you want to know?
What I want to know is what's going on between these two bits of metal.
Magnets repel each other.
And well, then what does that mean, or why are they doing that, or how are they doing it?
You're asking.
I must say, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question.
Of course, it's a reason. It's an excellent question. Okay. But the problem that you're asking, you see, when you ask why something happens, how does a person answer why something happens? For example,
and you see this in a lot of interviews. It's like he's playing 3D chess by answering the question based on how he wants to be perceived by the public, who will later see the interview or the newspaper article, rather than talking to the reporter like they're a human being. I don't think I find this quality particularly admirable a lot of the time. I mean, with the Challenger thing, I think it's really brave, but a lot of the times it's just annoying. It's just you know what a magnetic field is. Answer the question, bro. But the fact that he's so consistent is interesting to me. In this book of letters, here's a picture of the book. It's right there. In this book of letters, there's a bunch of back and forth with the National Science Academy, and he's just I don't want to be a member. Please remove me from your list. And they're like, we'll pay for your membership fees, because obviously they want him to be a member. He's very famous, and he's just no, I don't really like that kind of stuff. And he keeps responding, even though the answer is no, because I think he just enjoys the interaction. He just enjoys trying to be annoying to people. His brand is just creating this character of how he presents himself to the public, and he knows that. And I think it's really interesting that the second Ralph Leighton book is called What Do You Care What Other People Think? Because that advice was given to him by his wife Arlene when he was in his 20s. So this whole bit of being really concerned about what people think about you and trying to present who you are very specifically based on how you want to be perceived has been a lifelong problem for Richard Feynman, because he received that advice in his early 20s, and I think no man has ever cared more about what people think than Richard Feynman. Throughout his life, and it's hard for me to tell if this was a joke or not, he claimed to have read one book, Madame Bovary, which is a choice if that's the one fiction book you're going to read. And he has that bit in the Ralph Leighton book about refusing to read Faust, and I just find this really weird. Part of the Ralph Leighton story is there's this class where he's required to write a poem, and he writes this stupid, basic-ass bullshit poem that's, like, obviously mocking the assignment. Like, no, over here. The biography that doesn't need to be written, because why do we need another biography? They open with that poem as, like, the quote before the book starts, and it's like, but he obviously wrote that as a joke because it's so stupid. It's an insult to poetry, and you put it at the start as if it's meaningful? He fucking got you, Gribbons. Classic Feynman. Seriously, you put this at the start? Oh my god. This is just my opinion. Obviously, this whole video is just my opinion, but I feel like Feynman is one of those people who, like, obviously he was very concerned with being a sissy and being girly, and so I think he thought that he could not do art and also science. And so he thought he was being, like, cool whenever he was like, I am not going to read a book. All I do is play in my lab with electronic circuits. It's weird because in his 50s, he started doing a lot of art. He started playing the bongo drums, and, like, not just, like, playing for fun. He, like, performed for plays and things, and he started doing this art which he presented in galleries. Like, he is a very artistic person, which goes directly against with how he presents his relationship with the arts in his books. And I wonder if he changed his opinion on that over his life, if maybe he was like, you know, I am really interested in this, I can do it and still be a manly little man. Next, something I noticed about Richard Feynman in these books is that he was very kind to children. There are multiple letters after Richard Feynman died where these adults who used to be children wrote to his widow Gwyneth to say, like, I remember at my dad's party, Dick came over and just talked to me the whole time. I remember asking him about space, and he took 20 minutes of his time to just explain to me how stars work. Or, like, even Ralph Leighton. Ralph Leighton was 20. He was a young guy, and Richard Feynman just took him into his family and was like, we'll go on vacation together. We'll be buds. Like, every time Richard Feynman interacts with a child in these books, from his 20s to his death, he's, like, giving them his undevoted attention. He's treating them with respect, like they're little adults. He loved children. He had this childlike spirit, and his interest in science was like that of a child who's just, like, interested in seeing how stuff works. And I think that's a really good quality. That's a really interesting thing that is missing from the legend of Richard Feynman, which is basically he's always the smartest guy in the room and he hates women. Why not mention this? When we're telling our young boys that they should be like their hero Richard Feynman, why not mention about how he was super good with children? Why not? He also had his own children, which he always wanted to do for his whole life. By all accounts, he was a wonderful father, and not just a wonderful father for the time period. He was, like, driving them to school. He was showing up for events. In the book of letters, he has a bunch of letters where he's refusing to go give talks and refusing these, like, awards and stuff because he wants to stay in California with his family. Michelle Feynman talks about how when she was growing up and she did not want to do science, he had no problem with it, and he supported whatever she wanted to do. He was just like, oh, great. Follow your heart. And this is such a good quality for people to have. I just, like, obviously you get to pick how you tell the legend of whoever you're telling a legend about. I'm just shocked that so many people, Ralph Leighton, choose to be like, he was always an asshole, and boy did he hate women, instead of, like, the good stuff that actually does exist. Do you know what I mean? Speaking of women, let's talk about Richard Feynman's relationship with women, what he said versus Richard Feynman's actions in his life. I claim that the misogyny I experienced in undergrad is partially due to the misogyny in this book, where Richard Feynman, you know, pours water on a waitress, talks to a guy called the Master, tries to have sex with a woman, and when she says no, he calls her a whore, talks about the feminist pig ladies and how they're stupid and they can never like physics. That's what's in the book. Etc., etc., on and on. Feynman didn't write those books. And of course, as we've learned on this journey, those stories are not true. They're greatly exaggerated. Richard Feynman had a little bit of a problem with his masculinity and told stories he thought would make him seem cool to the young men he was telling them to. So, do we trust that information when we think, how did Richard Feynman find women? How did he approach his relationships with them? I don't know. So instead, let's look at the facts. So we can start with his sister Joan. Richard Feynman was a few years older. He went off to college and he really encouraged Joan to study science the same way he did. She was interested in space. He got her a graduate level textbook. Her parents were like, you probably don't need to get a PhD, and he really encouraged her. And Joan Feynman, of course, goes on to be a physicist in her own right. She's a famous astronomer, or she was. I think she died very recently. The first female professor at Caltech, I mentioned her earlier, Jenijoy Labh. She was a friend of Feynman, and she was denied tenure. She later sued, saying it was purely because of who she was, because she was a woman. And Richard Feynman wrote her a letter of support saying she deserved tenure as a tenured physicist at Caltech, and that was used in the trial, and she got tenure. Also his daughter, Michelle Feynman, she was adopted, meaning she was chosen. And again, by all accounts, a wonderful father. He loved his children. In the Rainbow book, where that guy is just creepily recording conversations with Richard Feynman, he asked him what his biggest regret in life is, because that's a normal thing to ask a man who's practically a stranger to you. And Richard Feynman, who's dying of cancer at the time, says his biggest regret is that he won't get to see his daughter graduate high school and go into adulthood. And that's the thing a wonderful, caring father says. It wasn't anything to do with physics or the people he could have had sex with. It was about seeing his daughter and being proud of her and her accomplishments. And that's really nice. And again, she's a girl. He treats her with respect. Okay. Also, he did, of course, say those sexist things. The sexist jokes that are in the Feynman lectures are in the Feynman lectures because he said them on tape. And also, Bob Leighton, you didn't think to change those? You just left those in as the author? What's going on there, Bobby? Anyway, he did say those sexist things. But I do think, as evidenced in all these books, the later in his life, the more likely he is to not do that. The more likely he is to call attention to the fact that it's inappropriate. In the Book of Letters, people are writing him to ask if they can publish his Surely You're Joking book in different languages, if they can translate it and publish it. And why? Why would you want to give that book to more readers? But Richard Feynman responds to these and says, some of the things I said that in that book will be unsavory to people. So you might want to remove that. You might want to think about that before you publish it. Why is it still being published today then? Why? I think that shows progress, in my opinion. In my opinion, he seemed to learn the error. Even if he didn't think he was sexist, he learned that it was inappropriate to say those things in public. And that's progress, in my opinion. So let's talk about Richard Feynman and his wives. He was married 3 times. First to Arlene. This is a very famous story. They met when they were kids. He goes off to MIT. He has to marry her. And she has TB, tuberculosis. Yes, I have pre-ordered John Green's new book. I'm very excited about it. And he knows she will die. And he kind of brings her to Los Alamos. She's at the hospital and he's going to visit her all the time. And I think you can really tell from the letters. I don't know how I feel about people's letters being published. That seems weird. But anyway, in the Book of Letters, you read the letters back and forth from him and Arlene, and you can tell that he loves her deeply, but also that she is his intellectual match. They are writing puzzles and code. And there's also this famous story of this letter that he wrote to Arlene 18 months after her death, which is incredibly sweet. He did love his wife. He treated her with respect. That's a thing generally misogynists don't do. And this is very similar, I think, to the relationship that's presented in these books with his third wife, Gwyneth. So they get married, and they're married until his death. And she also was dying from cancer while he was dying from cancer. It's a really sad story. But the same thing happens. In all the letters, people are writing Richard Feynman, and they're like, how's Gwyneth? And they talk about sitting next to Gwyneth and talking to Gwyneth, and Gwyneth planning all these trips. She wanted to go hiking in Mexico and go to Antarctica. She also very interested in the world, interested in history, interested in travel, and that's what her and Feynman bonded over. That's what they talked about. He was interested in her brain. He saw her as a person. Again, things misogynists would not do. Gwyneth is mentioned continuously in the letters. He is writing her letters. He is talking about her with his colleagues all the time. But in the Ralph Leighton books, Gwyneth is rarely mentioned. If she's mentioned, it's I was there with Gwyneth. And I think, just my opinion, just my opinion based on reading how much his friends talked about his wife versus how much he talked about his wife, I imagine at one point, Gwyneth Feynman was like, don't tell any stories about me that you made up in this silly little book. That's what it feels like. Just my opinion, that's just what it feels like, because he talks about all the other things. And, I mean, it's kind of a sign of respect that he listened, you know, in this story that I've imagined actually happened just based on reading all these books. It seems like she's purposefully not mentioned in the Leighton books because she didn't want to be, and I think that that's nice. So, in the books, Richard Feynman is like, I want to be presented as an asshole. I want everyone to know I hate women and I'm better than them. But in his personal life, that's really not how it seemed like he behaved. It seemed like he sought out relationships with women he could have intelligent conversations with. He sought out relationships with women he respected. And this reminds me of his second wife, which is, she's very briefly mentioned in Surely You're Joking. And the way she's mentioned is, it just stuck in my brain. It's because he's in Brazil and he's on a date and he goes to a museum and he's trying to talk about all the cool old things and the history of things, and the girl he's with is just completely uninterested. And he like gets annoyed and he's like, I miss Mary Lou. So he goes home, he writes a letter to Mary Lou and he asks her to marry him. He says, I miss you. He misses her brain. He misses what she thought. And I think, again, not a thing a misogynist would do. That story could be totally fake. Like, that story is Richard Feynman pretending to tell a nice funny story to Ralph Leighton, who 15 years later asks him to tell it again, records it on a tape, and then writes that account down in the words of Ralph Leighton trying to pretend to be Richard Feynman. So maybe it's not true, but, you know, Richard Feynman didn't write these books, but surely his thoughts were behind the moral of the stories? I don't know. I think I mentioned earlier about women's rights at the time, when Feynman is being a misogynist, like they can't open bank accounts, they can't start businesses, like they basically belong to their father until they belong to their husband. No-fault divorce was not a thing. So Feynman and Mary Lou, his second wife, do get divorced, and they have to give a reason for their divorce, because you can't just be like, we don't like each other anymore. And the reason for their divorce is also a very famous Feynman story, and it's usually some version of Mary Lou Feynman requested a divorce from Richard Feynman because he was always doing calculus while he was driving, while he was eating dinner, and if he wasn't doing calculus, he was playing his bongo drums. And everyone posts this as like, what a quirky guy, just doing math and annoying his wife. That would annoy me too, like calculus all the time. Calculus is really fun, but like that's like a lot of calculus. And for some reason, the second part of the story isn't nearly as famous. You know, like the Patriot Act, I think it's called, you can request government documents. Richard Feynman had a file with the FBI, not because of the Manhattan Project, but because Soviet scientists kept inviting him to Russia. And Feynman was like, oh, they're doing a lot of cool stuff over there, but obviously he didn't go. And it seems like maybe the Soviets had a plot to like get him over there, but he didn't go. Anyway, in the file, there is a document on page 64 about the divorce from Mary Lou that was published in the Los Angeles Times in 1956. Let me read it to you now. The appointee's wife was granted a divorce from him because of the appointee's constantly working calculus problems in his head as soon as wake, while driving car, sitting in living room, and so forth, and that his only hobby was playing African drums. What a guy. So silly. So quirky. His ex-wife reportedly testifies that on several occasions when she unwittingly disturbed either his calculus or his drums, he flew into a violent rage, during which time he choked her, threw pieces of bric-a-brac about, and smashed the furniture. Yeah, I know. I kind of thought that this was going to be a redemption story, but it's not. It's just not. I know we have a lot of fun on acollierastro, but I do want to pause here and be very serious for a second. If a family member or partner ever chokes you, you need to go. You need to leave. You need to run. Someone choking you increases your odds of being murdered in a domestic violence situation by 750%. It's never okay, and it shows that they are capable of murdering you, and you need to leave. I'm going to put up the National Abuse Hotline website. You can call You can text. They have a little chat box. If you are scared to do this because someone checks your internet history or they check your call history, go to your local library. They will give you a computer. You can access this website and use the chat box. You have to go. There is never an excuse. You do not deserve that. Okay. I think hero worship is bad, of course, because people are complicated, conflicting thoughts and actions and emotions, and Richard Feynman is, of course, dead. He died in 1988, and so us creating a legend that's like ignoring all the bad stuff just doesn't make sense. So I think we should just cut it. Like, cut it out. Like, what is it with this? Like, you can like Richard Feynman's papers and realize he was kind of an asshole. You can like Richard Feynman's lectures and you can enjoy watching him on YouTube and also, you know, realize it's kind of embarrassing that he made up a bunch of stories to tell his friend and then that got published in a book. And now we all have to know that it exists. You can know that he choked his wife and still learn how to do physics from him. All of those things can be true. These are Feynman tips on physics as presented by Angela Collier, not affiliated with Richard Feynman. I'm going to start with a pet peeve of mine. There will be like a Today I Learned post on Reddit, and it'll be like, Richard Feynman used his own symbols for sine and cosine when he was working out geometric functions as a child. They use this little tidbit as like proof of what a genius Richard Feynman was. And here's how that's phrased on Wikipedia. Thing is that that's just a thing that everybody does. Like when you're a child who likes math, you play around with geometry and it is legitimately fun. If you've never done it, just try it. Investigate some triangles. Legitimately a fun activity. And you get tired of writing cos theta, sine theta, tan theta, and you just shorten it. I wrote S parentheses theta. You know, you could write S with a line through it. Everybody does this. And it's honestly not indicative of future Nobel prospects. It is just a thing everybody does. And it's weird to me that you would choose that little anecdote and be like, Richard Feynman was such a genius, when you could choose an actual anecdote. I want to talk about a super cool thing Richard Feynman did when he was very young that shows that he was very, very smart and had a aptitude for math and science. Okay, so in 1939, at age 21, Richard Feynman published this paper as an undergrad, a single author paper as an undergrad. Now, this was easier back then, but it wasn't common. It's much harder now. But this is an impressive feat because he was assigned a problem and he really worked through it and tried to understand some things and wrote it up. And his professor was like, we're publishing this. And this paper had an impact on the field of chemistry. So he published a paper, people read it, had a theory of Feynman, and used it in their work. This is an incredibly impressive thing for a 21-year-old to do. So when Feynman worked at the Manhattan Project, he was a group leader for the computers. And at first, they were human computers, and then they got like punch card machines. So of course, a lot of people at the time predicted the importance of computers and what they would do when they were better. He would talk to the designers and engineers of computers, and he really understood how they worked on a fundamental level. And he also predicted the importance of like making these things smaller and smaller and smaller. A lot of people say quantum computing was a field that was created by Richard Feynman. I would say he was involved. I don't know if he was like the father of quantum computing, but there's a really great lecture you can watch, and the lecture on computing book, obviously not written by Feynman, but it's really interesting. It's really interesting to read someone thinking about the birth of computers and predicting their future usefulness from a physics perspective. He talks about like randomness and how a quantum computer, like a quantum event, would take care of that. He talks about thermodynamics and how like data is actually stored. I would suggest watching some of that. It's really, really good. But I also think that is emblematic of what makes a good physicist.
So there are some things that a computer does much better than a human, and you'd better remember that if you kind of compare machines to humans. But what a human has to do for his own, they always do this, they always try to find one thing, darn it, that they can do better than the computer. So we now know many, many things that the humans can do better than the computer. She's walking down the street and she's got a certain kind of a wiggle, and you know that's Jane, right? Or the sky's going in and you see his hair flip just a little bit. It's hard to see, he's at a distance, but that particular funny way that the back of his head looks, that's Jack, okay?
He sees like new upstarting fields. Does he go think string theory is the most important thing happening? No. He thinks it's computers, and he was right. And he was headhunted by this corporation, and he helped build the first parallel processors. Really interesting. His perspective on computing is really interesting, and if I could recommend one book, would it be that one? I would at least recommend watching this video. Now I'd like to talk about another pet peeve of mine, which is Feynman was the only physicist to ever think outside the box. I think I know where this comes from. So people are doing quantum mechanics, and I talked a lot about this in my QCD video. People are doing quantum mechanics, and they are using like the linear algebra matrices representation of those events to do it. And it's very complicated. And Feynman is, of course, incredibly well read. He reads all these papers, but also when he reads a paper, he tries to work it out for himself. So he's reading these quantum mechanics results, and he chooses, instead of doing matrix representation, to do these integrals, these path integrals. It's called the path integral formation of quantum mechanics. And he develops these diagrams to simplify the integrals he has to do. Okay, this is him thinking outside the box, right? People are doing matrix math, he's doing integrals. And there's this famous story where Richard Feynman goes to a conference and he tries to present this idea, and he's like, look at my integrals, and it's a total flop. Everyone is like, I see you getting the right answer. What does this mean physically? Because in physics, you have to understand the math you're doing. You have to explain why the math does what you say it does. And getting the right answer is just not enough. So Freeman Dyson, who was a British physicist, friend of Feynman, introduces all these books. All these stories are true. Freeman Dyson, he recognized the importance of the Feynman diagrams. He goes home, he proves mathematically that the process Feynman is using with the path integrals is equivalent, is identical to the matrix math. So both of these things work to give the same answer, and the physics is the same. And Freeman Dyson very famously asked Feynman if he wanted to publish it, like just take it and publish it. And Feynman was like, but you did it. So Freeman Dyson publishes the paper. This is what Feynman gets his Nobel Prize for, because this method was used to develop a theory of quantum electrodynamics, and Feynman shares his Nobel Prize with two other people who got it for the same reason. So I do think it's very silly to say Feynman's the only one to ever think outside the box, when literally 3 people share the prize because they were all thinking outside the box to solve the new problem. It's just really dumb to say physicists don't think outside the box. What does that mean? What do you think we're doing? What do you think research is? Do you think we're just repeating the same experiments over and over and over again? Actually, there's a problem that we don't ever do that. We're always thinking outside the box. The box doesn't exist, which becomes a problem because we don't look back to check things. Physicists don't think outside the box has to be right up there with like, Einstein was bad at math on the physics anecdotes. Like, think about what you're saying. No, actually. Physicists do think outside the box. And of course, Einstein was very good at math. My goodness. Also, I kind of think Freeman Dyson should have got the Nobel Prize, because he's the one that did the physics part. Like, Feynman found a math tool, Freeman Dyson explained it. I don't think Freeman Dyson felt that way. He really, like, in his biography, he's really just like, Feynman had this great idea and I just happened to, figure it out and write it down and stuff. He seemed to really idolize Feynman, which I think is a mistake to do. Anyway, I think the physics tool to take away from this is to work out the problems for yourself. Not only should you be constantly reading papers, but you don't understand the paper unless you can figure out what they're doing and you can understand it and you can, use the Feynman technique to explain it to someone else. My next Feynman tip for physics, remember this is just my opinion. I am Angela Collier. I'm unaffiliated. I never met Feynman. He died before I was born. This is just my opinion. I think this is the most interesting thing I learned about Feynman after reading all of these books, which is that he was often quoting other papers, quoting other people's ideas, and not attributing credit. And so all of the editors of these books, the actual authors of these books, had a really hard time going through like a Feynman lecture or a Feynman speech and figure out where he got the idea and what was his original idea. I think it's fine that Richard Feynman gave these smooth lectures where he just elaborated on ideas and did not spend, 70% of the lecture time being like, this was a Dirac, this was an Einstein, this idea is from a little known 16, like, that would be crazy. That's not how lectures work. But when you write a book, of course you have to do the citation. The physics tip I get from this, though, is that Feynman just had all that in his brain. He didn't necessarily remember where he got the things, but they were just in his brain because he read so many papers, and every time he read a paper, he tried to work it out for himself. So when he just goes to start talking on a topic, he can just pull it out of his brain. And I think that's so impressive and so amazing that he just maintained this like encyclopedia of physics knowledge, and he got all of that from reading. And it was so vast that when people go to try and credit the sources for all the things that he had stuck in his brain, it's a difficult task. I find that really interesting and really impressive. And I think if you want to be a Feynman-style physicist, that's where you should start. Read everything you can and stick it in there and remember it. I think this is my last Feynman tip. So the last thing I noticed about Richard Feynman is he didn't take a lot of grad students. And he also did not publish a lot of papers. In fact, not prolific at all. Interesting. And this is also a different video, but there is a very famous problem in academia right now where in order to get proposals granted or to get tenure or to get a postdoc, you have to publish. And if you only publish like one paper from your PhD, you're just not going to move on. It doesn't matter how good or impactful that paper is. So what people will often do is take a paper that's a nice little paper and they'll split it up into a series of 4 papers that are just not as good. What is it? The sum of the parts are not as good as the whole? Like once you break it apart, you don't get the whole story, and the introduction is the same and the conclusions are the same, and it's a waste of anyone's time to read all 5 of these papers. So many papers are published every year, and so many of them could have just not been. And Feynman took the approach of only publishing when he was finished, only publishing when he had a neat little story on what to say. I talked about the gravity book. Feynman spent, I think it was like a decade, trying to figure out a quantum field theory for gravity, and he was unsuccessful. If Feynman was working today, he would have published 14 papers on his quantum field theory of gravity that didn't work. And instead, he just talked about it with colleagues. He just gave a course. He just talked about it, tried to figure it out, but found that he didn't have it, so he didn't publish it. And I think that is a lesson for us all. Feynman was a random man. We should not worship random dudes. If you want to be a physicist, I think Feynman's tips on physics would be very helpful to you. Sorry this wasn't a redemption video. Feynman as a person kind of sucks, but other people really liked him. Feynman as a physicist, 10 out of 10, he nailed it. End of video. Okay, so this is a bonus Richard Feynman on crackpots section of this video. This is from the book of letters that's compiled by Michelle Feynman, his daughter, but also these are factually like documents that exist. So Feynman actually said these things. And it says he was on a television program called About Time. And there was a viewer who they call Mr. Y who kept, here it says, he complained about the presentation of the orthodox viewpoint on relativity, wrote the station to complain multiple times, and he sent it to Richard Feynman, called his ideas about time propaganda. And Richard Feynman responds, but I think it's brilliant the way he responds. Like, he writes this little letter, and he's like, I would be surprised but very pleased to learn about that there is another point of view for which successfully does these two things. Predicts correctly all those effects which have been carefully observed experimentally, predicts a different result for the traveling twin. Sincerely yours. And then it says, Mr. Y replied with several successive emotional letters that attacked Feynman for joining the scientific establishment. Of course, crackpots have always existed and they're always the same. Mr. Y's views, but never explain clearly what those views are. So Mr. Y is sending these like, I understand physics, you don't understand physics, it's propaganda, you're part of the physics establishment, but he's not sending any physics, you know, exactly what a crackpot does. And the way Richard Feynman responds, he gives him a problem. I don't know why I'm showing the camera, I'll just take a picture of this. He gives him a little problem and he asks, okay, you have this situation and you put a particle, what do you think happens? What is your view of physics, Mr. Y? What do you think happens? And Mr. Y is excited that he's responded and he didn't answer the question. He can't because he doesn't know physics because he's a crackpot. And Richard Feynman again responds and he's like, well, you didn't explain what happens. And he says, I don't know what your opinion is in this matter. I don't see much use in our writing letters back and forth because I don't know whether my views disagree with yours or not. You speak of our opposite viewpoints and my arguments, but I still don't know whether we have opposite viewpoints or any argument on this result. In short, I don't know what your viewpoint is. And Mr. Y responds with the same like establishment and he's like, please answer the question. Don't go on telling me I ignore relativity in my thesis or speaking of my philosophy or that I ignore the fact that a meson is a particle, etc. All that may or may not be true. Are you trying to tell me I can't set up the counters in the arrangement indicated on the magnetic field of approximately 10,000 Gauss cannot be made? Or that there are no mu mesons? If not, and you agree, I can set up the apparatus in question. Then tell me what you expect the counting rate in the counters will be. And he never responds again. I think that's brilliant. Like, my standard response to crackpots is ignore, obviously, because they're scary. But what he does is say, okay, what is your understanding of physics? What do you think will happen here? And it's just like this jumping off point of like, if you have an answer, he can correct you. If you don't have an answer, you don't have anything. All you're trying to do is think you're really good at physics and you don't understand because you're the crackpot. And I think this is brilliant. Just responding to a crackpot with like, okay, so I put an electron in an accelerator that looks like this. What happens? Do you understand physics? Do you understand basic physics? Or are you talking out of your ass? Brilliant. Okay, real end of video. God, I have to stop.